Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of The Voice of Neuro World Discussion with Agent Smith. Today is February the 14th. It's about 6:30 p.m. Pacific time, and it is snowing all over the place. How are you doing, Agent Smith?
I'm doing all right. How are you?
Pretty solid, pretty comfy. I'm warm and I have enough food inside, so I will survive.
I'm glad to hear it.
Yeah.
It's very cold.
It is, but I've got heaters on. I've got a nice hoodie, so I think I'm pretty much good.
Bam. First world solutions.
I also got slippers for Christmas, so I'm extra resistant to the cold. These slippers have 15 frost resistance.
Excellent.
Mm-hmm.
Well, did anything strike your fancy in the news the past couple weeks?
Well, the first big ticket item, which we mentioned before going live with this, but you've said it isn't really new news, is the coup in Myanmar. So you were saying that the military has taken control there multiple times historically, and in a previous Agent Smith, we talked about some other countries that have a similar track record, like Egypt and Thailand. Basically, if the military doesn't really like whoever is governing, they'll just switch it around. So what happened this time with Myanmar?
Well, I would elaborate on that by saying that Burma was a part of the British Empire for a long time. And I think they got independence in 1947-ish, something around there. And pretty much right away, the military seized control and held control over the country uninterrupted for the next couple decades. So through the 1940s, the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and most of the 80s. So about 40, 50 years or so. And it was only in the late 80s that there was an attempt to liberalize the country. That was a grassroots movement that was led by Aung Suu Kyi, or at least she was one of the leaders anyway. It was a big protest movement, and I think there were elections, but it ended up with it ended in military coup. You know, the military didn't really want to give up control. And when it became apparent that Aung Suu Kyi and the Liberal Party were going to win most of the seats, the government just ended the whole experiment. So other than that brief interruption, the government of Burma has been under military control since independence. So from that 1947 period to 1988, and then for like a couple years, they were pseudo-liberalized. And then from then through the 1990s and aughts, they were controlled by the military again. And it was only in around 2010 that they decided to open up the country again. And that actually had to do with two things. One, it had to do with the fact that Burma's economy was becoming increasingly dependent on China, which the Burmese military was not comfortable with. They didn't like the idea of China having quite so much leverage over them. So the government decided to try to open things up a bit to create more balance between the influence of China and some other powers, you know, the rest of the world, basically. Another factor was the typhoon, I should say. There was a big typhoon that hit Burma around that time, and it was very disruptive. It did a lot of damage to the economy, and the government was very unpopular as a result because their disaster relief efforts were subpar, you know, both because of corruption, you know, insufficient resources, and a general pre-existing distaste for the military government to begin with. All of that was not in their favor. So the government kind of felt like they had to do something to try to alleviate the political pressure, and liberalizing the country was one way to do that. So between those two factors, the government ultimately decided to release political prisoners and agree to hold elections, which they did about 5 years later in 2015. And when they did, the military was surprised by how well the Liberal political party led by Aung Suu Kyi performed. They had been expecting them to do well, but they had a military party that was running against them that they thought would pick up more votes than they ended up getting. You know, basically, Aung Suu Kyi's party won almost every seat that was available to be won. And the only reason the military ended up having power in the legislature was because the Constitution that they had wrote and enforced mandated that 25% of the seats in the legislature were appointed by the military, thereby giving the military strong influence in the legislature, regardless of how many people actually voted for them. It also gave them a de facto veto over most any major changes to the Constitution. So, because of that, the military was surprised, like I said, but they ultimately decided to just run with it because it didn't really matter that much. Because another thing that the Constitution that they wrote did is to give the military de facto autonomy over certain areas of state affairs, specifically national security. So internal security and foreign policy and external security, those were areas that the military had de facto independent freedom of action. They didn't require any permission from the civilian government in order to take action in those policy areas. So, as you can tell, the civilian government really didn't have a lot of power in this new constitution, and that was by design, because while the military was willing to liberalize a little bit, it was not willing to fully liberalize. And it wanted to make sure that there were strong institutional mechanisms to minimize the degree to which the military's power could be genuinely challenged by civilian reformers. From the civilian reformer perspective, they were willing to take that deal because they thought it was at least a step in the right direction. And they figured that the longer democratic institutions were in place, then the more of a constituency would develop that would resist any attempt to get rid of it or change it substantively into a more authoritarian model. So there was a kind of contest after that between the military and Aung Suu Kyi's party. I should add here, maybe it's not too important, but I can't remember the exact name of the Liberal Party in Burma, but it was not technically led by Aung Suu Kyi. She was sort of the figurehead leader. She would have been the actual leader, but the problem is that the constitution the military wrote stipulated that anyone who held foreign citizenship or had held foreign citizenship at any point could not hold office in the country. And Aung Suu Kyi had British citizenship because she'd married, I think, a British citizen at one point. So they basically wrote that constitutional clause specifically to prevent her from holding any kind of office. So technically, she's not the head of that political party, but de facto, she is the head of the political party. She just kind of has an informal role within it, in which everybody in the party recognizes her as the de facto leader and kind of does what she says. So the actual president, civilian president, prime minister, I guess, of Burma is not technically Aung Suu Kyi, but she's like the power behind the party. So everybody treats her as though she were, basically. So that said, just getting that out of the way. So there was a contest between Aung Suu Kyi and the military after 2015, in which the military kind of went out of their way to put her in an impossible catch-22. And it was actually pretty smart of them. So this is the Rohingya issue that I think everybody remembers at this point. So there's a sort of ethnic/religious minority in Burma called the Rohingya. They're an Islamic, they adhere to the Islamic faith, but ethnically they're kind of related to the principal Burmese ethnic group, but they're also a little different. I think one of the big differences is racial. They're actually not really Asiatic in race. They're actually sort of more South Asian. They tend to have darker skin and more sort of Eurasian features as opposed to being Asian. So they're basically a very identifiable minority within Burma. And for a long time, for several decades, they've been sort of considered migrants rather than citizens. It's sort of broadly suspected that they were actually people who had illegally migrated across the border from Bangladesh into southwestern Burma. And that didn't really mean a whole lot over time. Lots of populists and whatnot kind of tried to make it an issue, but it really didn't become a major issue, at least as far as I know, until after 2015. And part of the issue was Facebook. When the country opened up, they opened it up to some of the internet. They didn't have fully open access to the internet, but Facebook came in and basically provided it. So in Burma, the internet is associated with Facebook because in order to get access to the internet, you pretty much have to use Facebook. So Facebook, of course, has kind of a mixed bag in terms of how strict it is with what you can post on Facebook. To be fair to Facebook, it's hard to moderate when you're trying to moderate, millions of people who are actively trying to get around any censorship, that you might try to impose. And so that became a problem because a lot of populists who didn't like the Rohingya started posting agitprop on Facebook. And that got people pretty riled up. And I think the straw that broke the camel's back was an alleged rape that had happened. Allegedly, a Rohingya man had raped a Burmese woman of some, other ethnic group. And that spread out across social media very quickly. And the result was ethnic clashes, which eventually the military got involved in on the side of the people fighting the Rohingya. So the reason this is relevant to Aung Suu Kyi is that all of this sort of ethnic conflict, and specifically the targeting of the Rohingya, was actually pretty popular with the broader part of the Burmese public. Because again, they didn't see these Rohingya as being actual citizens. They saw them as being outsiders. And, when the rest of the world started pressuring the Burmese government to stop attacking the Rohingya, for the most part, the public was actually on the side of the military. So that was very awkward for Aung Suu Kyi because, of course, she was a well-known human rights advocate. She'd won the Nobel Prize and she'd won all these accolades and, awards and stuff for trying to stand up to the military. She had been fighting for democracy for a long time by that point. I think she'd been under house arrest for something like 20 years through the 1990s and aughts before it finally ended during the liberalization in 2010. So she can condemn the military, which as a human rights advocate she should do. But the result is that she and her political party would take a big political hit. And that would make the military and military-affiliated political parties much more popular relative to her. And that's, again, a catch-22, because if her party loses seats to the military-backed parties, then there's basically not going to be any further liberalization. Whatever little room liberals in Burma would have to fight for further civil rights and further political opening, that window would effectively be closed if the military were to significantly expand their seats in the legislature. So from Aung Suu Kyi's perspective, she has to choose between fighting for more liberalization in Burma at the expense of the Rohingya, or standing up for the Rohingya and closing the door to further liberalization. And ultimately, she chose to side with the military on this issue. I think she tried to pick her words pretty carefully. I don't think she ever explicitly supported the violence against the Rohingya, but it was pretty clear she never really came out fully against it, up to the point where I think she ended up going to the UN at one point and defending them. Although, again, I think she used pretty guarded language when she was doing that. She tried to sit on the fence, but it wasn't really possible. And so as a result, a lot of her international support just evaporated. And so now she's kind of associated with genocide as a result. But again, to reference something I said earlier, it was the military largely committing the atrocities. And again, the civilian government had no control over the military. There really wasn't anything politically she could do to stop them. It just wasn't really feasible. Her only power was to come out against it or for it. And again, she ultimately decided to try to take a middle path, which just didn't work. So without the same international support that she had before, she was much more isolated, although she did preserve her political support amongst the populace, to the point that in the recent election that was had just a few months ago, which is the second election in the reform period, she once again did really well. Her political party picked up almost all of the seats in the legislature. In fact, they actually picked up more seats than they won in 2015. And the military didn't like that. And it's not entirely clear why, but the military started making noise about election fraud. They were saying that, the other side had cheated, or that there had been some form of election fraud. They never really specified what, but that was their accusation. And they did that for a couple months, and then just this past month, they decided to seize power and overthrow the government. Now, when I say seize power and overthrow the government, it didn't really require much, because again, they already had most of the power anyway. Basically, this military coup consisted of saying that they're just going to not listen to the civilian government anymore and start arresting civilian political leaders. So it wasn't like this was like a huge overthrow of the government. For the most part, it was just eliminating what little part of the government was controlled by the civilians. But it was a pretty significant reversal from the previous stance of the military, which was to try to allow some room, some liberal space for people to try to enjoy freedom of speech and some political freedoms other than that. But from what I've read, it's just not entirely clear what their end game is, what their strategy. It's not even really clear why they did this. Accusing the other side of election fraud is probably a red herring. It probably is just an excuse so that they can, get rid of the civilian government. But given that they already had most of the power, it's not obvious even to experts, that I've been reading, just why the military thought this was necessary. I mean, it would have been pretty easy for them to just ignore the civilian government anyway, if they really wanted to. Getting rid of them doesn't really get them significantly more power within Burma's political system. So it's just not obvious what they're planning here. The only convincing argument I've read that rationalizes the military coup is that the leader of the military, I don't have his name in front of me, but the general that heads the military is about to retire and was planning to retire by becoming a politician, basically leading one of these pro-military political parties and getting a seat in the legislature and then living off of the salary thereof and eventually pension. But it seems that maybe that plan had to be scrapped because the military parties just weren't winning any seats. There was just very few. And it seems that maybe this guy did not think his retirement plan was viable if the military parties weren't winning enough seats. And so for that reason, they've overthrown the political order that they had created, the limited liberal space that they had created, so that this guy can kind of preserve his power and have something of a safe retirement. It's kind of a weird argument, but this actually isn't that uncommon. I mean, the military coup part is a little much, but it's not uncommon for authoritarian political leaders to face a significant challenge in how they retire. Because, if you give up power and you're an authoritarian, then that means whoever your successor is going to also be an authoritarian leader. And if they want to turn on you and take all of your wealth and throw you in prison or kill you or whatever, there's not going to be anything you can do about it. So authoritarians face a very difficult challenge in trying to kind of tread the line between giving up enough power to just kind of retire without giving up so much power that they feel in danger. And, this is something that Vladimir Putin over in Russia is kind of trying to do right now. And something that Nazarbayev over in Kazakhstan has already done, successfully so. It's always a difficult thing to do. And I think this guy, this Burmese general, just didn't plan it well. And I think because, he has all the cards, because he's the head of the military, and the military is the preeminent political institution in Burma, it wasn't that big of a deal for him to say, okay, we screwed this up, let's just scrap the whole thing and do something else. So in that sense, I don't even know that this was necessarily like a dramatic decision for the military. It's not like they were just felt really threatened by the civilian forces. It may have just been as simple as wanting to scrap the whole system so that a system more amenable to this guy's retirement could be constructed in its place. Almost sort of a routine reform effort on the part of the authoritarian leader there, just to make sure he could be more secure once he kind of starts distancing himself from his role as head of the military. But that's conjecture. The real answer is we don't know why they did that. So we're just going to have to kind of wait and see.
Yeah, it does seem kind of tough. Like, I've been really brutal to the population, and they just aren't very nice to me when I want to stop working. I did see some stuff about Putin's, like, super elaborate multi-billion-dollar palace that he's made and stuff. So he's getting set up. Yeah.
Putin has been trying to kind of rejig the political system so that he can kind of maintain influence without having to exercise actual political power within the political system.
Look, I want all the advantages of being in a really powerful political spot, but I don't want to have to do the unfun stuff.
That's what it comes down to. That's what it comes down to. That's what the constitutional referendum that we talked about in Russia was about.
Mm-hmm.
That this past summer, that was interrupted obviously by COVID, much to the chagrin of the Russian government. But they ended up managing to get it passed anyway, which surprises nobody. Yeah, it's very difficult strategy to pull off because you never know who's going to stab you in the back once they have power.
Mm-hmm.
So you just have to be very ginger and delicate in how you engineer whatever necessary institutional changes you have to make to ensure your safety. So that may be what happens next in Burma. It may be that what happens next is that they create a new system in which the military has even more political power and in which there is some mechanism by which former generals can have a significant political role in running the country.
This is making me feel like it's a pretty advanced thing for a military to grant control to the people in an office who are working with papers, because the monopoly on violence is a requirement for having a system of government. Like, you need to make sure that you can defend yourself and you can administer justice in your area. So why would the military, if they have the monopoly on violence as an institution, why would they hand over power to an executive branch or a legislative or judicial branch? Because it's nice. If that branch is acting purely out of self-interest, like, there has to be some cultural norm or motivation to pass along that responsibility to a different group.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. Yeah, it's pretty hard to create a political system where the forces that wield the monopoly on violence are willing to respect civilian authority.
Mm-hmm.
For a long time, it just came down to loyalty to your king. And, in a feudal era, it was just most of the fighting was done by nobles. If you were a king and you went to war, then you would put out the call to your nobles who ruled the different lands in your kingdom, and they would come out and they would, get on their horses and be your cavalry.
Mm-hmm.
And warfare in the medieval period was pretty cavalry centric. So most of the armies were generally nobility. And so that just came down to loyalty. You had an oath to your king in which you would answer the call in exchange for the king basically protecting your lands and, whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
So that system was obviously very unstable, because if you were a noble and you thought you were more powerful than the king, or if some other king was willing to give you a better deal, then you could just not answer the call. You could just break the oath, and there wasn't really a whole lot of consequences to that. Some reputational cost, but if the potential gains are great enough, you're willing to kind of look past that. So over time, as the state centralized, it was more about money. Because what happened over time is that cavalry kind of gave way to these large mercenary infantry armies. Pikemen, I think they were originally, but later on they became, pike and shot and musketmen, these kinds of formations. And because they required so many people, they were very expensive. But one of the things that happened sort of after 1000 AD is that commercial activity in Europe picked up significantly. And most of that happened in cities, and a lot of the cities paid taxes directly to the king rather than to any particular noble. And so that meant that the king had a big advantage in terms of financial resources. And so they could field these big armies of infantry that nobility just couldn't. So that kind of started the transition from decentralized feudal kingdoms towards centralized bureaucratic states in Europe. And so long as you could pay money, then your mercenaries, of course, are going to fight for you. So later on, in the 19th century, it was more about nationalism. So people would fight for their country because it was their duty. They kind of had a duty as a citizen, as a nationalist, to come and fight for their people. So that was something that the French really started during the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. And that kind of snowballed with time. It was kind of a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, yes, you could conscript people and force them to fight, but you kind of had to make sure that you were actually fighting a war where they felt that they were defending their country and not just like an arbitrary war of conquest or something. I guess a war of conquest is okay if you're fighting for Napoleon. Obviously, he fought quite a few. But I think if you're going to, use nationalism in order to try to build an army, you have to make sure that you're pursuing nationalist goals and not just self-aggrandizing as a king. So nationalism was kind of this countervailing force to traditional monarchical forces in Europe in the 19th century. So monarchies tried to exploit that where they could in order to sort of maintain their legitimacy. It was sort of a back and forth battle throughout the century. I think we all know how that ended. It ended very poorly for monarchy. Liberalism ended up winning out. So since then, there's kind of been a contest between sort of democratic constitutional liberalism and more sort of rugged nationalist liberalism. But that's a whole other conversation. Conscript nationalists, nationalism as a justification for conscription, though, that is one of the things that one of the tools that you use in order to justify forcing people to fight for you. So beyond that, since then, we've shifted away from conscription and towards professional volunteer armies, at least in the West anyway. And in those cases, the reasons that the military honors, so to speak, civilian authorities has more to do in that case with just sort of a combination of tradition. It's just sort of how it's been done for so long now. It seems weird to do otherwise, but also honor. It's sort of this. Governments today derive their legitimacy by representing the will of the public, or at least that's how democratic regimes try to maintain their legitimacy. So if you're a general or an officer in the military and you want to stage a coup, you're basically going against the will of the people, so to speak. So if you do that, you'd better be ready for a lot of political unrest. Your regime is going to be very illegitimate. So you have to play your cards right. You would have to build up a constituency amongst the public that would support you doing that before you could make it work. And at that point, it's not really a military coup per se. It's more just a coup of one political faction against another. That's kind of what happened with pan-Arab nationalism in the Middle East. There was a lot of support for pan-Arab nationalism and not a lot of support for the monarchies that ruled a lot of Middle Eastern countries in the early mid-20th century. So yes, a lot of Middle Eastern monarchies were overthrown by militaries, but those militaries had a lot of popular support. Well, the officers in the military that were perpetrating the coups had a lot of popular support. And so they were conferred with relatively more legitimacy than the monarchies had. And so they were able to rule, at least for a while anyway, with popular legitimacy, basically as avatars of pan-Arab nationalism.
It's reminding me a little bit of the Way of the Samurai. I've been reading through Hagakure, and one of the things that's drilled into how you should conduct yourself as a warrior is to be very dutiful to your lord. And that's one of the most important things about being a warrior. So I would guess that many other cultures have a similar sense of honor and duty, where the people who fight are fighting in service of something greater than themselves, rather than just a pure bandit rule, which is I fight to claw for more for myself. You can achieve a lot more as a person, as a human being, by engaging with the group in some capacity. And if you treat the group well, or at least some part of the group, then that's going to give you a lot of advantages. So I guess it makes sense too for the military to be in service of something else or some other group.
Yeah, it works until it doesn't. There's always flaws in that. Mm-hmm. In the case of like a feudal system, again, if there's some other power that comes in and buys off your nobles, then you're kind of screwed. That's actually that's actually one of the main ways that the British Empire in India was built. The Mughal Empire in India, as well as the Maratha Confederacy, and sort of these other big powers in India at the time. They were mostly feudal in terms of their political organization. And so one of the things that would happen during wars with the East India Company is that the company would literally just bribe people not to fight for, whatever empire they were at war with. That was one of the reasons they won the Battle of Buxar. I don't quite remember. There were two big battles in Bengal in the 1750s and 60s that really sort of marked the beginning of the East India Company's rise to power as a force in India. They'd been there before that, but after this, they controlled territory. They were actually literally on the map of India after that. And one of the things they did to win those battles is that they actually successfully bribed some of the nobles that had mobilized to fight with the Mughal emperor to just not show up. They brought their armies there, so they were there, but on the eve of battle, they just didn't come. They just took their armies and went home. And so that was not the only reason they won those battles. There were other factors at play, like having professional European officers, having modern cannons, stuff like that. More sort of granular military science type stuff. But bribery was definitely in their favor, and feudal systems are very susceptible to that. Because if you are a feudal lord, if you are a noble, then you basically control your territory. You basically are the government there. So there's no inherent threat to you per se if you don't do what your lord says, especially if you know that your lord is busy doing something else or fighting a more powerful enemy or whatnot.
Mhm.
That's why feudal empires are so prone to collapse. It's not so much that they break apart Soviet style, where they just break into constituent parts. It's more just the nobles who control territories that are already basically semi-autonomous, just stop giving a shit what the central authority says, because they don't think it has the power to punish them for not honoring their oath to their lord. And so they just start doing what they were doing before, but without any, care for instructions from some higher authority.
Mhm.
So there's the issue there with militaries in a feudal sense. And of course, in terms of mercenary armies, the problem is that they're only as loyal as their paycheck. And if you stop paying them, then you're really in trouble, because they're going to be ripshit pissed at you. And they've got lots of pointy, sharp things that they can use to express their dissatisfaction. And that was something that happened a lot in the 30 Years' War, back in the early 1600s. Most of the armies then, the 30 Years' War was brutal. It was really interesting. For those of you who are not aware of the Gods and Generals, or what was it? Kings and Generals, that's what it is. Kings and Generals YouTube channel, they did a really good series on the 30 Years' War, as well as just everything. That's a really cool YouTube channel. If you like military history, definitely check that out. But in the 30 Years' War, almost all of the armies were mercenary armies. And what would happen is that, when the war ended, or even before the war ended, when, this, that, or the other noble lord or king or what have you would just run out of money, then there would be all of these just thousands of mercenaries who didn't have anything to do. They couldn't really go home because there wasn't really economic opportunities. The devastation of the war had just completely just gutted the economy of Central Europe. So there just wasn't a lot of ways to make money, legitimately. So what a lot of these guys did is they would just turn to banditry. They would just raid the countryside, steal shit. It was pretty brutal, really. It was extremely violent. The whole region was very unstable as a result. So, mercenary armies not only have the problem of requiring, a consistent flow of funds in order to stay loyal, but, when they are no longer loyal, not only do they come after you, they create broader instability in whatever region you're in, because they're running around undermining the local political structures and the local economies. So that's the weakness there. In terms of nationalism, armies that are sort of predicate their legitimacy and loyalty to the state in terms of nationalism, they're only as loyal as they think the state is honoring nationalism. So I can, in that case, I could use the pan-Arab nationalist example again. In those cases, the monarchies that controlled their countries were very unpopular with nationalists. And as a result, it was very easy then for the military, which was mostly filled with officers who believed and adhered to pan-Arab nationalist ideology, to get together enough support to stage a military coup and just overthrow the government. So long as the government is legitimate in the eyes of nationalists, then you're okay. But when it's not, then you're kind of in trouble. In terms of liberal democracies, it's really shaky depending on government legitimacy. It doesn't have to be nationalist, though, in the case of like a modern liberal democracy. Just so long as the state is legitimate to enough of the population, the military will generally be loyal. But there's no guarantee. We're kind of seeing that now in the United States, where there's sort of a growing chunk of the voting electorate that does not see the state as being legitimate, which is very bizarre. As an American, that's not something I would have expected to ever see here, but here we are. It's also a little unnerving because this is actually playing out very similarly to how the collapse of liberal democratic political culture occurred in Colombia. So in Colombia's case, the state had legitimacy as a liberal democratic state, which represented the will of the public. And there was a tradition of the military not getting involved that had been honored since the late 19th century, I think. But then there was growing partisan tension in the 1930s and 40s. And eventually that just exploded in the, La Violencia, I think is what they call it down there, sort of this period of political violence that started up in the 1950s, I think it was, and then eventually spiraled into the Civil War that would, play out for like half a century after that. But in that case, the military eventually did, I think, challenge the authority of the government a couple of times during that period. I don't think they were ever successful in overthrowing the government, but the fact that it happened at all was genuinely shocking to people at the time, because they didn't think that their political system was so fragile that could even be a possibility. I think there was something similar in Chile that happened in the 1940s, where there was some officers that tried to stage a coup that failed, but it was just really unnerving to everybody because nobody had really thought that could happen. So we may be on track for something similar in the United States, which I'm sure will be very interesting. I don't think there would be enough support for any kind of coup in the officer corps right now in the United States. But that doesn't mean that somebody won't try. So if you think American politics is crazy right now, you can imagine how much crazier it's going to get if somebody stages some kind of failed coup attempt in the US military.
I think our military has been historically stable. No? Has that happened before?
No, not to my knowledge.
Okay.
The political culture in the United States is very, very liberal. That's very much put on a pedestal. And honestly, one of the reasons that our military has been so well behaved over time is specifically because of that. It's not necessarily institutional protections per se. It's more just that from the very start, we have enshrined independence, small government, etc. That's just part of what the state's legitimacy is predicated on. And because that was just drilled in very early on into the very design of the US political system and in the structure of the US military and in the culture of the US military, that's considered a very, very powerful norm that everybody has honored in the US military for pretty much from the start, at least thus far. So we're fortunate in that sense, but there's no inherent reason that's going to last forever either. Again, loyalty is predicated on the legitimacy of the state, and the legitimacy of the US government at this point is increasingly coming into question. Hopefully, that's a temporary phenomena, a kind of function of the era we're in. I would point out that the United States is not the only developed country that is experiencing this. It's pretty much something you see everywhere. Even a lot of developing countries are experiencing this, which makes me kind of suspect that this is a function of the internet, the explosion in information, the increase in connectivity, the easing of the barriers to organizing and communicating with people. All of that was always going to have a dramatic effect. We just didn't really know what it would look like. And it could be that this is it. It could be that it's just much easier for dissatisfied political forces to organize and coordinate together to a degree that was not really possible before. And thus, you can kind of get these people who, even in a liberal democratic state, just don't see the state as legitimate for whatever reason. Sometimes the reasons are good, sometimes they're bad, and sometimes they are impossibly stupid in some cases. But regardless, they're there. And they are a relevant political force that you kind of have to deal with. So that could be the result of technology, but it could also just be a trend. It could just be the result of governments getting more and more power and becoming more centralized over time. Besides communications, there's also just bureaucracy. As bureaucracies have expanded, because they have access to more tax revenue, because the economies in developed countries have improved and increased so much over, half a century, what have you. As resources available to the state have increased, the capacity of the state's bureaucracy has increased, and that doesn't always sit well with everybody. Just having a larger state in general is a problem for people, especially in the United States. But even if you're okay with having a bigger state, having more state capacity creates any number of disagreements about how to use that capacity. Some people want it to be used to do one thing. Some people want it to be used to do another thing, and there's always limited resources. So those people are always, kind of bumping up against each other, arguing over that. So a larger state with more capacity has a lot of benefits. It allows the state to do things that it couldn't do before, solve problems that it couldn't solve before, etc. But it also creates a lot of political friction because there's always opportunity costs to the state doing any one thing. And that inherently means that some political faction that wanted it to do something else is losing out. So as we see more state capacity, we're going to see more political friction. And that could also be what's causing sort of the political discord in developed countries right now. Of course, there's also the structural economic argument that I've made any number of times on here. It might just be that traditional livelihoods are disappearing and being replaced with new forms of economic activity, and that the transition is just very rough and is not really providing enough opportunities for people of certain backgrounds. I think people who are with high school educations, I think they in particular are finding it very difficult to make a living sort of in the modern economy that has emerged in the developed world. And as a result, there's a lot of political discord because nobody can really fix that. It's very hard to do because the economy itself is just transforming by itself in a way that's removing those opportunities. It's not something that the state is doing. So it's not really something that the state can necessarily fix. So you either grow the state a lot to try to provide people opportunities, give them government jobs, or I don't know. I don't know what else there is. I mean, if I did, I would have, a very interesting answer there that a lot of people would be very interested in, because this is something that's very much a topic of discussion in public policy circles. It's especially a problem in the United States, because here in the United States, people don't like the idea of a large government. So we're kind of blocked off from that obvious avenue. So we have to kind of figure out something else to do that kind of reaches political consensus. It's also a problem in Europe, though. And, in Europe's case, I think people are okay with a large state. So they probably wouldn't mind so much if the state jumped in and provided a livelihood for people whose traditional livelihoods have been disrupted by economic changes. But their problem is that a lot of those states in Europe are over leveraged. They just have too much debt. And so they can't really spend a whole lot more than they're already spending in order to provide those kinds of livelihoods. So basically, they're already tapped out. They're kind of at maximum capacity in terms of what they can do. And so they're stuck between a rock and a hard place. If they try to provide significantly more resources, they're going to have to borrow more money, and then there's going to be a debt problem. And then there could be a, financial crisis again. I'm sure everybody remembers what happened the last time. It was pretty hard. So that's the rock. And then the hard place is that if they do nothing, then the civilians think that the government isn't helping them, and the state loses legitimacy. And then you get all of the problems that are associated with that. So there's a catch-22 in Europe too, not just the United States, in terms of this problem. And it's not really clear how states are going to maintain their legitimacy in the face of that. So that's the structural economic argument there for political discord in the modern day. Yeah. But anyway, that all just kind of came from that discussion about why our military is loyal.
Yeah, why do they respect other institutions? And I had a fun conversation with my parents breaking down the meaning of classical liberalism, as opposed to, in the casual American sense, usually you say those gosh dang liberals means those heckin' progressives. So it's people who are either socially or economically progressive. But classical liberalism means you put faith in the institutions to do their designated duty. So that means that since we put high faith in our institutions, we believe that the legislative branch does legislation, the judicial branch does its judicial shit, the treasury does its job, and you kind of expect everyone to be mostly upright with how they're doing things, which is kind of like the inverse of a culture of corruption, where it's normal and standard to just kind of do behind the back, under the table deals. I'll do a favor for you, do a favor for me. Obviously, every system has some level of corruption, but in some countries and some systems, it's like par for the course to be corrupt, and it would be weird if someone was principled. Whereas if you put high faith in institutions, it's expected that you try your best and do your job, and then you have a few bad apples. So.
Yeah, political pluralism, rule of law, judicial independence, representative government. You know, these are all sort of the basic building blocks of any liberal political system. And so, in that sense, pretty much everybody in the US is politically liberal.
Mm-hmm.
There's not like a lot of constituents for authoritarian political ideologies of one sort or another, which is one of the things that kind of makes the US unique, because you can generally find them more in other places. I was actually talking to a friend about that not too long ago. Well, not quite like about that, but about sort of the uniqueness of the Western Hemisphere. Because to a degree, the entire Western Hemisphere is defined by liberalism as an ideology. I think some parts of the Western Hemisphere are better at it than others. Obviously, places in Latin America kind of struggle to make liberal democracy work in the face of corruption, in the face of the weight of history. Obviously, historical factors make it really difficult to run a non-corrupt political system in a lot of places. But I think everybody kind of still wants to be liberal. Everybody kind of believes to a degree in liberal democracy in the Western Hemisphere. I don't know that there's really any states, like other than Cuba maybe, where liberalism is not the crux of the political culture to some degree. Obviously, in some places, they kind of believe more in socialist ideologies, sort of like the Chavismo states, Bolivia, Nicaragua to a lesser degree, Venezuela. But even in those states, the government's legitimacy is still couched in democratic terms. They just kind of try to define liberal democracy a little differently.
Mm-hmm. So we kind of connected Myanmar to Russia, mentioning Putin, which is its own big can of worms with the Navalny, this individual who was poisoned, thrown in jail. What else has happened to this guy? I think he's basically the tip of the spear in terms of outspoken opposition to Putin. Like, being critical is something that historically they just silence the critical voices, and that's that. Whereas he has gotten away with more and kind of eluded their ability to fully silence him.
Well, I don't know that I would go so far as to say that Russia routinely silences critical voices. One of the interesting things about the way that Russia's political system, its modern political system, has been constructed is that they create relatively more room for criticism. Historically, through the 90s in particular, but also even in the 10, 15 years after Putin took power, they generally allowed a fair amount of criticism. They didn't really care too much if you didn't like them. It's only really been since, I think, 2014 that they've really started to consistently crack down on dissent in a meaningful way. And that's kind of a weird transition that I don't understand, really. Because they were doing fine before. It's not as though Putin wasn't popular before. He's still pretty popular amongst the broader part of the population there. So I'm not really sure what Putin's government really hoped to gain by by cracking down more and kind of limiting the scope of criticism. But it's something they've done. I kind of suspect maybe it has to do with Surkov. I think it was Surkov. Yeah, Kudrin was the economy guy. So Vladimir Surkov, I think, was the political advisor that helped Putin construct Russia's modern political system. And I think he hasn't really been listening to him as much lately. I think his influence has waned within the administration. Because a lot of the things the Putin government has been doing for the past, 5, 6 years, I guess 7 years technically, a lot of it has been stuff that I would expect more from a government that had more of a military tack to it. For those not familiar with the Russian government, a lot of the high officials in the Russian government, the most powerful leading figures are siloviki. They're basically former military guys who were linked somehow to Putin. Because Putin is a former KGB agent. He was in the national security state. So he has this extended network of people who are also in the Soviet Union's national security state that are in his patronage network. Mm-hmm. So those are the people at the top of the system. And they're the ones, I think, who have been pushing him to be be less tolerant of dissent. So that's why I say I suspect that Surkov isn't as influential. Surkov is no liberal himself, from what I know of him, but I think he was a lot smarter about handling dissent than, whoever's advising Putin right now. It just seems very self-defeating to do this kind of stuff. But regardless, you're right that they are kind of cracking down, but it's kind of more of a relatively new thing that's been escalating over time. Navalny, but Navalny is kind of an internet guy. He's a blogger, YouTuber, what have you. All of his political activism is done online for the most part. And for a long time, he wasn't really that effective. He was really good at kind of getting young people involved in politics. That's usually how I've read him described, that younger Russians are more familiar with him and that are kind of energized by his politics. But he's never really been like a politician. I think he did try to run, I think a year or two ago or something, for mayor of Moscow. And I think that was one of the first times that he was just put in jail outright. But before that, he was not like a major political force. Before that, the major political opposition forces were, to varying degrees, the communists, the liberal nationalists, the liberal Democrats, I guess. The liberal Democrats in Russia are neither liberal nor democratic. They're actually like ultra-nationalists. And then there actually are, I think, a handful of democratic parties like Yabloko. I don't even know if Yabloko is still around. They may have disbanded or merged with some other party since then, but there were some. I think Nemtsov was the head of one of them. Nemtsov was that opposition guy who was assassinated a few years ago. That's another sign of how much more oppressive the regime has gotten. I don't think they would have ever allowed that. I don't think they would have bothered assassinating a guy like Nemtsov before, but since they've started getting more paranoid, I guess their risk preferences have changed a bit. But since the crackdown has started and since legitimate political opposition has been increasingly marginalized, the internet has kind of become this reserve of opposition politics, and Navalny has kind of by default become, the avatar of Russia's opposition. And so as a result, the government has been paying more attention to him. And so I think late last year he was poisoned. It was actually his underwear. They actually put polonium on his underwear. And he got sick on the flight that he was getting on. And I think he was looked at by some Russian doctors, and then he ended up leaving for Germany, where some German doctors looked at him. The Russian doctors had been saying stuff like, oh, it was probably something he ate, blah, blah, blah. And when he went to Germany, the German doctors said, yeah, he was definitely poisoned. It was pretty obvious to them. So it was another polonium hit, probably. So since then, he's come back to Russia, basically daring the government to come after him again, which they did. He was already kind of up on, they'd already brought up charges on him for some stuff he'd done before. I don't remember what technically it was. But they're probably going to put him back in jail. The charges are kind of popped up. They have to do with, I think these are the charges that related to the lumber business. Maybe somebody more familiar with Russian politics than me can kind of elaborate on chat on this. But I think Navalny was accused of being involved in a corrupt lumber business scheme back in the 1990s. And honestly, it wouldn't surprise me if it was true. I mean, corruption was pretty much par for the course back in the 90s. Pretty much everybody who was alive in the 90s, or at least of age in the 90s, could probably be accurately accused of engaging in some form of corruption. It was pretty much a survival tactic. So the fact that the government is going after him in particular for this is kind of telling. It's very much selective justice, you might say.
Yeah, kind of like trying to pin him down for something. Doesn't really matter what it is. We just need a reason to chase him.
Yeah. Yeah, so he's been up on those charges for a while, and now they're kind of, I think they gave him a delayed sentence. I think that's what it was. They'd originally kind of had the trial and then gave him like a delayed sentence type thing where he could kind of stay out of jail, but they could kind of bring him back in whenever they wanted. Mm-hmm. So now they want to bring him back in, so they've kind of brought him back to the court, and they're going to do the whole spiel, and he's going to end up back in prison. I think the most interesting thing Navalny did recently, since he was poisoned, is that, we really are in the dumbest timeline. You're going to love this. I don't know if you've heard of this before, but this is a great story. Navalny and some of his buddies managed to get the number for somebody who they suspected had been involved in the poisoning, like an agent of the Russian government, like a full-on member of the FSB? There's two major national security institutions in Russia. One of them is the FSB, and then they have another one, the name of which I can't ever remember. I think they had both been are both successors to the KGB. The KGB was broken into these two institutions in the 90s in order to kind of make sure there was no centralized national security apparatus that could kind of be as powerful as the KGB. But anyway, I can't remember which agency these guys were. This guy was the agent of, but Navalny somehow found him, and he actually called him. So Navalny called this agent that had been accused of poisoning him, and Navalny straight up just pretended to be his boss. He pretended to be a guy in the agency he worked for, and said that there was some loose ends, some paperwork he had to do in order to kind of close the case. And so he just started asking him all these questions about the poisoning and what he'd done and where he'd been and when. And the guy totally fell for it. He was just giving out all these details about this assassination attempt over the phone for what amounts to a prank call.
Oh, man.
It was one of the most bizarre things I've ever read.
Hey, credulity is a strong bias. Whenever people tell you something, it's more natural from a just human cognitive perspective to believe what they're saying, especially if they say it in a convincing way. The movie Catch Me If You Can is a hilarious set of examples of this, of a real guy in U.S. history who was so good at bullshitting people that he could cash whatever fake check he wanted. He could be a pilot. He could be a teacher. Like, he could do whatever because he watched a couple TV shows, tried to imitate and mimic how people in that role would talk and behave. So if he's really pretending to sound like a boss, if you question your boss, you're going to get in trouble. So I don't know. If you ask the right person who's not like trained and prepared to detect the bullshit, then yeah, they can just give away all the clues and information.
Yeah, and that's apparently what happened. So it was a pretty damning evidence that the Russian government had been behind it, which kind of casts a lot of doubt on some of the Russian government's statements on previous examples of poisonings, like that former Russian agent in London, the whole incident with, I can't remember what it was, Skripal, something. There was like a Salisbury, there was like a town in the UK where they tried to poison a guy and they failed. I can't remember the name of it, but it was a whole kerfuffle diplomatically. So the Russian government had said that it wasn't them, that it was like somebody in the UK had done it, or, somebody else. They just denied all responsibility. So now that we have this evidence that Navalny actually was targeted by the Russian government, that really kind of confirms a lot of suspicions in the West that the Russian government was actually behind all of those previous incidents. So pretty embarrassing for Moscow, all told.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think there's been too many developments since then. Nothing that I can remember off the top of my head. That's pretty much where they are. Oh, you know what? There was protests. There's been nationwide protests in Russia because of Navalny going back to prison. The Russian government has been trying him, suspending the suspended sentence in order to bring him back in. So that sparked a bunch of protests around Russia in different cities. I haven't gotten the impression that they've been large enough to really threaten the state's legitimacy. So I don't think it's really going to go anywhere. But it really does suggest that the government is kind of losing its ability to manage public opinion. And it kind of makes me wonder how they're going to deal with that. So that's some drama for Moscow to deal with.
Mm-hmm.
We'll see how that plays out. That'll be something to keep an eye on. If I had to guess, I'd say that Moscow will probably just try to wait for it to go away. Because again, they don't have to worry too much about it. Putin still has enough legitimacy that the government doesn't have to worry too much about organized opposition.
Mm-hmm.
So they may just try to wait it out. It's pretty much what Belarus has been doing. When was the last time you saw Belarus in the news?
Oh, it's been a bit. That's the dictatorship in Eastern Europe?
Yeah.
Yeah, I watched a documentary on that a little bit. They were going around trying to film stuff, and there were a bunch of different minders and things who were following them and telling them to stop. Look at this lake in the middle of the town. There was supposed to be a project here, but it's all gone to shit and it's an eyesore and everyone's really upset, but no one does anything about it. So we're filming it here. And then someone walks up to them, hey, you can't be filming here. And it's just like a random ass pond, but you can't film there because apparently there was a government promise of something a while back and it hasn't happened. So they're trying to get the word out, and other people, I guess they just see cameras as bad. We know that we're up to no good and people aren't supposed to film it. So put that camera away.
Yeah, that's pretty much how secret police work. Was the documentary foreign or local?
They had a local journalist they were following, so it was a set of foreign journalists who were following a local journalist, so I guess both.
Yeah, they would have had people following them then.
Yeah.
That's generally how it works in places like China, Belarus, what have you. If you're a foreigner, especially a foreign journalist, then they almost always have a security guy who's tasked with either following you or just outright going with you. They may require that you have a literal minder go with you everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I remember Anthony Bourdain had a minder when he was traveling in Vietnam for one of his episodes back when he was still doing those. So yeah, not too surprising that they caught up on them pretty quickly there.
They showed a theater crew who were probably more candid and genuine about the problems of the country, but they were doing it through a theater performance, so you can kind of get away with a little bit more than if you just did a cut and dry article that was critical of the government. It showed more of the suffering in story format, but it was very underground. Like, it was hosted in random people's houses and it kind of rotated for locations. So it's like, okay, for this theater production, it'll be at this person's house. Next time, that place will probably get turned over, so we're going to have to go somewhere else. You take those things for granted, You just like go to a subpar theater play at some local venue and you see a show, and maybe some people did pretty well, but that's about it. In other places, it depends on the content, and governments care about the content of the message in just a random theater play.
Well, underground theater has a long history as a form, a medium of opposition. People activists back in the 60s used to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Just have little stage plays out on the street in order to kind of criticize the government or, whomever they weren't liking at the time. How are we doing? Let's see. An hour, okay. So, I guess I should take the time here to do the usual disclaimer. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about, which is probably pretty obvious. So if I ever say anything that's wrong, biased, or stupid, please do let me know. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. So encouragement by chat is encouraged. Participation by chat is encouraged. I don't read chat while we do this, but I will read it later, so I will see comments eventually.
Humility? What? I thought when you talk about politics, we're all from our armchair general position and we're experts, huh?
I had to retire mine. It was getting old.
Your armchair chair is no more?
It is no more.
Dude, my chair company is out of business.
You had a chair company?
Well, I was sponsored by OP Seat, but they were brutally tariffed. Apparently, they had gotten some of their raw materials, like parts that go into the chair, from China. So when the trade war stuff was happening, it was just not a viable business model for them anymore. So they hung up the hat. So I've got a very rare chair that is no longer obtainable.
Ah, very fancy. You'd better take care of it.
It's decent. I wouldn't say it's incredible.
Well, the important thing is that it still works.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, chair. So we hit Myanmar, we hit Russia, just for a general sense, because I feel like it's kind of Twilight Zone really weird. We haven't even said the word Trump yet. And usually it's like, a bag of bullshit of different random things that happen. So Biden Harris, like, how is it going? How's the start overall? It seems like they're shipping through another stimulus kind of bill where people are going to get another check in the mail or something.
Yeah, I think they're looking at 1,300,
Mm-hmm.
and it's going to have a cap. So if you make beyond a certain amount of money, you're not going to get any. Or I don't know how the negotiations on that are going. I haven't been following it too closely. I think it's either going to be a hard cap where you just don't get any money beyond a certain income level, or if it's going to be sort of what they did with the last one, where they start diminishing returns beyond a certain point. So you'll still get some, but it won't be as many as somebody who's below the cap.
Mm-hmm.
So there's been a lot of debate about that in Washington, but I think it's going to happen. I think they definitely will get it passed. That's something the Democrats have been pushing really hard. From what I've been reading, the Democratic Party kind of angsted over strategy, as pretty much both parties have been for a long time now. So the question was whether or not they should try to do a bipartisan bill in order to kind of build comity, basically, in order to set a precedent for cooperation, in order to try to appear to be sort of trying to rebuild ties and ease partisan tensions. So that was one possibility. But then the other possibility was just to try to push one through, which technically they could do using what's called a reconciliation bill. And they could do that without any Republican support. So that's not great for dealing with the partisanship problem, but it does at least get something done relatively quickly, probably much more quickly if they were having to negotiate with the GOP. So that was the debate, and ultimately they came down with, ultimately they decided to go with the latter option. They decided to just push the bill through without significant GOP support. And the reason they did that is, looking back, they figured that they did better when they tried to get something done rather than trying to wait for bipartisan consensus. Back in the Obama days, back when they were trying to get healthcare reform done, they generally tried for bipartisanship. They tried to get a bipartisan bill that would get at least a few GOP votes. But that took a lot of work, and ultimately it didn't really come to fruition. And the perspective in the Democratic Party is that they were punished for that politically. That what they ended up getting done was not really sufficient to get them any kind of political reward with their voters, and ended up just exacerbating partisanship anyway. So from their perspective, it's better to just get something done that the public will like and hopefully get rewarded for it, rather than getting into the partisan trench warfare and ending up with the worst of both worlds, where there's still partisanship, but you also have pissed off your voters because you didn't really get as much done as you could have if you just pushed something through. So that seems to be the strategy they're going to go with this and probably other legislation. That's probably going to aggravate the political right in the United States, but I think the argument that they were going to be aggravated no matter what they did is probably accurate at this point, especially given the growing chunk of the Republican Party that is basically just the Trump party. So for them, it doesn't really matter what you do.
Yeah, you've said before that it seems like the GOP needs to figure out where its point of unity is. Like, is it the Trump party now, or is it going to swing back to more of an establishment Republican position? Because it seems like there's quite a strong divide between those two demographics sometimes.
Yeah, that's been the other drama happening, actually. So besides the Democratic Party trying to pick a strategy and figure out how they want to do what they want to do, the Republican Party has been having an internal battle also, trying to figure out what kind of party it is. And so that's kind of played out in the form of the impeachment proceedings vis-a-vis Donald Trump. So at first, it seemed like there was at least a fair amount of support in the GOP, or at least amongst Republican senators and House representatives, to impeach him. And that ended up getting walked back. So ultimately, he was let off. I mean, for anybody who hasn't been following it, Donald Trump was acquitted. So the impeachment proceedings are over, which may be for the best. That's kind of a whole other discussion. But that whole process just kind of ended with nothing. It was very anticlimactic. It was just sort of done. So I think it was only 3 days of actual hearings, and none of it really went anywhere. But the Republican Party Specifically, I think Mitch McConnell, so is the head of the Senate Republicans. He had said earlier that Donald Trump was explicitly responsible for the riot, for lack of a better term, at the Capitol building back in January 6th. So there was a strong suspicion then that he would vote against Trump in the impeachment proceedings. But Mitch McConnell ultimately ended up voting against impeaching, or against convicting, rather. You'd already been impeached. And different people have different readings on that. My suspicion is that, one, there just wasn't enough votes. There were too many senators, Republican senators, who didn't think that they would be able to avoid a primary challenge if they voted against Trump. And I think also there was sort of the procedural argument. So there was the argument that you can't convict a president after he's left office. The idea being that if you did, you would set a precedent that anybody could be impeached, regardless of whether or not they'd been president, and then prevent them from becoming president later. So, if somebody is running for president and you don't like them, you could just impeach them and stop them from running for president. One of the things that happens when you're impeached and convicted for it is not only that you're removed from the presidency, but you're banned from holding office in the future. So there was the argument that that would be a bad precedent to set. So some people take that at face value. I think there's a fair argument to be made that that's legitimate, and I think conservatives have generally taken that more seriously. But I think there's also a suspicion on the part of the political left that Mitch McConnell only made that procedural argument because he didn't want to vote against Trump. And there may be some substance to that. It could be that Mitch McConnell used the procedural argument to get out of the vote so that he could avoid pissing off anybody. If he votes for it, then he's aggravating. If he votes to remove Donald Trump, then he's aggravating the Trump part of the party. But if he votes against it, wait, am I saying this right? If he votes to remove Donald Trump, he pisses off the Trump wing of the party. If he votes against it, then he's pissing off the moderate wing of the party. There we go. So he gets around that completely if he just uses the procedural argument. So in that sense, if that's the argument, if that's accurate, then the Trump impeachment proceedings suggest that the Republican Party still hasn't decided what kind of party it wants to be, and that the Republican Party leadership hasn't figured out how to reconcile the Trump wing of the party with the traditional wing of the party. And in that sense, McConnell's strategy here of trying to avoid having to make a decision that would piss off one or the other faction suggests that the Republican Party leadership is going to try to avoid any future conflict between the two sides. Rather than trying to recognize the conflict and deal with it directly, they're going to try to kick the can down the road and avoid it as much as possible in the hope that it kind of reconciles itself over time. And maybe if Trump stays out of politics or tries to get back in politics but does it really ineffectually, which is quite possible, maybe in that case that's a good bet, because then you don't have to really actively fight the Trump wing of the party. You just kind of let it shrivel on the vine. But that could backfire, obviously, if Trump succeeds in maintaining influence in the party, in which case you're just sort of delaying things. And in that sense, it would be better to try to have the confrontation now, when the Trump wing of the party is relatively weak after the January 6th riot, and try to use that leverage to reach some kind of favorable consensus. But of course, even that wouldn't necessarily work. It could be that that just blows up in their faces too. There's really not any certainty at this point in American politics. There's not like a clear path forward for anybody. So I don't entirely blame them for trying to kick the can down the road and delay some kind of final decision about how to manage the differences between factions in the Republican Party. Just as somebody interested in the future course of American politics in general, I would prefer that they settled it now, just so I could have some certainty. But I don't fully condemn them for just avoiding it, because that is a very thorny political issue for them. So the Democratic Party is going with, as far as their political problem, they're going with short-term gains at the expense of dealing with the issue of partisanship. The Republican Party, in contrast, with regard to its political problem, is largely delaying dealing with it in favor of focusing on common ground, basically. So either of those strategies could blow up.
Mm-hmm.
It's not entirely clear. We're just kind of in wait and see mode as far as American politics goes.
Yeah, it seems a little bit like a damned if you do, damned if you don't. But yeah, they're definitely on the back foot now politically, the Republican Party. So him making a strong choice there would be something that created more division, which is maybe inevitable. We'll see. Yeah, it does seem a little bit like damage control. I had seen the argument that it would be better not to like super aggressively prosecute Trump because that would occupy the news cycle for another year or two.
Yeah. Yeah, that's kind of what I was hinting at when I said that that's sort of the conversation there. If they had gone full tilt to try to go with the prosecution, that would have been a thing, and it would have been a huge distraction for both parties. So in that sense, the Democrats benefit because they can focus more on other aspects of their agenda and try to get those passed. And the Republican leadership benefits because they can avoid the drama that comes from that within their party.
Mm-hmm. It's tricky because it sounds a little bit like, well, we can't put you in timeout because you would throw too much of a fit, and we don't want that to happen.
Well, really, the whole impeachment thing, the second impeachment was always kind of more symbolic. Because honestly, it's a bit of a stretch to impeach somebody after they leave office anyway, just because it's so unprecedented. And I don't think they ever really had the votes anyway. Mm-hmm. So I think most of that was more just political theater than anything. It wouldn't have broken my heart to see him removed from office, to see him successfully impeached and convicted. I'm on record. I try to be impartial on here as far as, describing public policy and sort of some of these political differences. But I've never been a big fan of Trump because I've never really seen him as being like a political guy. He just seems like this weird aberration in American political history. So it wouldn't break my heart to see him impeached and convicted, but I never saw it as likely. So it always seemed more like political theater to me. The outcome doesn't surprise me at all.
Yep, well, that's the thing. We soldier on.
We try to.
Whatever we have happened these 4 years.
Well, I mean, if there is a positive takeaway there, if ever there's been a stress test of a political system, it's been the past 4 years in the United States. Mm-hmm. And in that sense, we've done pretty well. I mean, there wasn't any kind of collapse. There wasn't even really a collapse in political norms, which were heavily challenged by the Trump administration, but never explicitly broken in a lot of cases. And in the cases where they were, there was a lot of pushback. So in terms of abuses of power and outright corruption, it was at least manageable, and largely the political system was able to contain that. That doesn't mean it's a good idea to keep testing, the regime like that. Safety boundaries, safety rails are meant to prevent you from falling over their edge. They're not meant to be jumped up and down on. So I think it would be a really good idea if American politics would get off the edge there and try to get back to something resembling normal politics. Because just because we passed this test doesn't mean we're going to pass the next one. Mm-hmm. But overall, we did decent. We did pretty decent. We held out. So I think that at least leaves some room for optimism.
Well, that's good. We could use all the optimism we can get.
It's something. Let's see.
Well, speaking of going through some trials, how's the UK doing?
Oh, God.
Is that a bad question?
Oh, no, it's not a bad question. It's just there's just always Brexit drama. It's always something over there. Yeah, there's been a lot of economic disruption, which I think everybody kind of knew was coming. Everybody kind of figured that transitioning from an open borders regime to a significantly maybe not significantly restricted, but to a more restrained border regime was inevitably going to cause problems. Because for one, it all just happened too fast. Really this kind of thing should have been rolled out over the course of like a year or several years. But instead, they pushed the negotiation right up to the last minute. And as a result, the final agreement just, nobody had enough time to learn what was in the final agreement. So it just ended up getting implemented lickety-split, really quickly. And so all of the economic actors, not only in the UK, but in Europe, have just been playing catch up, trying to figure out how all this stuff impacts them and how to deal with it. So, I think when we were talking about this before, then I think I predicted that it would probably be really disruptive for like the first month or two, and eventually things would settle down. So that's pretty much what's been playing out thus far. A lot of firms, businesses, especially small businesses, have been really heavily inconvenienced by the changes that have been implemented. One of the big things that I've seen referenced is health certificates. So especially in terms of the fishing industry and the agricultural industry, a lot of food now that previously you could just ship to Europe, no problem. Now you have to ship it with a health certificate. And, that sounds pretty simple, but there are requirements to getting a health certificate that actually make it tricky. Like you have to apply for the health certificate a certain amount of time before you ship. And it takes time for the health certificate to actually, get to you and for the inspector to look at your stuff and to just do all that stuff. So filling out the paperwork also adds time. And the result is that it takes like several days or even weeks in order to get all of the paperwork done that you need done in order to ship something. And in that time, all of your stuff is just rotting. A lot of food and meat has been just rotting in storage because a lot of firms have been caught off guard by just how difficult it is and how much time it takes to actually do the bureaucracy necessary in order to get your stuff moving. So that's been a pretty bad hit to the agricultural industry in the UK. And, for producers in the European Union also, it's probably been very inconvenient, at least for those of them that export to the UK. The fishing industry has been getting hammered too, in particular, because, fish rot pretty quickly. You need to get those to market very quickly and have them on a plate and, relatively quickly. It's not like certain other kinds of foods where you have more time. So the fishing industry in particular has been hammered financially by a lot of the disruption in trade.
Mm-hmm.
I think manufacturing hasn't been as bad as I thought it would be, because there was some expectation that the rules of origin restrictions would really hammer some British manufacturers, but I don't think that's been as bad as forecast. So that's at least been a bright spot. It's still been an inconvenience for them. I think shipping is very expensive right now, so that's kind of hit them. Services is a whole different thing. That's some other drama that's going to play out. We talked about this before. Even though there's a free trade deal between the UK and the European Union, there's actually still going to be ongoing negotiations about the financial sector, because the financial sector was not covered by the free trade deal that was agreed. So there's going to be a separate deal that's agreed that covers explicitly the financial sector. And that's largely that's going to be over what's called equivalence. So in order for British financial firms to trade freely in the European Union has to officially recognize equivalence for the UK financial sector. And the equivalence just means that British financial rules and regulations and whatnot and standards are sufficiently equivalent to European Union equivalents that they can have access to the market. So right now they actually don't have equivalents, and there's actually been some disruption to the financial trade as a result. It hasn't really been that bad. Mostly I think it's been things like stock trading and other kinds of things, but contrary to what you might expect, stock trading is not really like the most important part of the financial sector. There's investing and stuff like that. That's kind of more important. And a lot of those flows have been ongoing and haven't really been impacted too much. So overall, the UK's financial sector is doing fine, but there has been some disruption there. And I'm sure the financial sector would prefer to continue having access to what is a very large market. It's kind of interesting. I was reading an article that there's actually differences within the financial sector about who would prefer equivalence with the European Union and who would not. From what I read, sort of the traditional investors and investing firms in London, especially the bigger firms, really want equivalence because they get a lot of business from the European Union. But the riskier part of the British financial system, hedge funds and institutions like that, they actually don't really care because most of their money is actually coming from the Middle East, Latin America, East Asia, places like that. So not having access to the European market doesn't really impact them as much, so they're not really as invested in getting equivalents. So that was an interesting divide within the sector that I hadn't really been aware of. It was pretty interesting to read about that. But that's pretty much where Brexit is right now. It's just sort of a lot of chaos and, a lot of food and rotting in storage and shipping problems, trucks getting stuck in long lines, unable to move. I think some firms have just stopped exporting to the UK altogether just because it's just too much trouble, at least for the moment. So they might come back later, but for the moment they've quit. So that's helped alleviate some of the shipping pressure. But it's certainly been a problem. It's been quite the circus, and it's exactly the kind of circus you would expect to happen with negotiations playing out the way they did, happening so rapidly and not allowing for a transition period where people could kind of learn the rules and adapt accordingly. There's also been some Northern Ireland drama. I don't know, have you heard anything about this?
I have not.
Yeah, so this had to do with the border between Ireland and Northern Ireland. For those of you who maybe remember us talking about this in previous episodes over the past 2 years, it's been a long and winding road. This has been a recurring topic on here. So one of the things that was negotiated was the Irish backstop agreement, and that, of course, took various forms over time. But the final form was basically that Northern Ireland would be treated as part of the European Union, and that there would be a border inspections regime, basically a customs regime between Northern Ireland and the rest of the United Kingdom, which was very controversial, but ultimately it was the only compromise that they could reach that everybody could agree to. So in effect, there hasn't really been any disruption in trade between Ireland and Northern Ireland because that border is still open. But all of the shipping drama that's been happening between the mainland UK and the rest of Europe has also been playing out between the UK and Northern Ireland, because there is a customs regime that is implemented there that's exactly the same as the one that's being implemented with the European Union. And so a lot of people in Northern Ireland are really put out by that, especially the unionists in Northern Ireland, who are worried that maybe this just builds more of an argument for separating from the United Kingdom and joining up with Ireland. So there's been some consternation in that regard amongst the politicians in Northern Ireland. It's also been interesting, though, because some other drama happening in Europe right now has to do with vaccines. COVID is like really the main story. I mean, if we were really doing like a major authentic world news segment, we would only be talking about COVID. But it would be kind of boring because everybody talks about COVID. Everybody's covering that. So I tend to try to talk about other things at this point. So the drama in Europe right now is that the European Union and individual European governments ordered a lot of vaccine late last year so they could have it ready early this year and start vaccinating their populations. But the trouble is some of the vaccine makers are behind schedule. And I'm behind reading myself. I'm behind schedule myself in terms of my reading. So I haven't caught up entirely on just what the vaccination companies' excuse for this is. But basically, they're behind on their shipments. And European governments are very upset about that. And they kind of went into panic mode for a while because they were really worried that they wouldn't be able to vaccinate fast enough and that their populations would be really angry at them and that they would get blamed for it. So one of the panic moves that they made is they actually temporarily closed the border between Ireland and Northern Ireland. Now, this is a big deal because for years during the Brexit negotiations, the European Union's position is that in any final agreement with the UK, there would have to be an open border between Ireland and Northern Ireland. That was the core of their position. It was one of their red lines that they refused to allow be crossed. So it was a little jarring for the British government to see them, not even that long after the implementation of their free trade deal, to see them just close the border. And it was very consternating for everybody, especially Northern Ireland, which, like I said, is already struggling with disruptions in trade between the UK and Northern Ireland. So with the EU closing the border between Ireland and Northern Ireland, now Northern Ireland is basically cut off from everybody. So that's a big problem for them, and they screamed bloody murder about it. So it only lasted, I think, a couple days before the European Union backed off because they recognized what a stupid move it was. And I should explain why they did it. So the reason they did that is because they were worried that the United Kingdom, which is outside of the European Union, might try to import vaccines that were being purchased by the European Union and distributed within the European Union. So because there's that open border between Ireland and Northern Ireland, hypothetically, somebody in Northern Ireland could buy a bunch of vaccine in the European Union single market, import it into Northern Ireland from Ireland, and then ship it across the Irish Sea to the United Kingdom. And so the United Kingdom might be able to get access to European Union vaccines that they were not supposed to have access to in that way. Now, that was never particularly likely. Again, it was a panic move on the part of the European Union because they were worried that they weren't going to have enough vaccine as much as they thought they were going to get. And so they tried to do little things like that in order to try to restrict the outflow of vaccines outside of the European Union. So there was a bunch of drama over that. It was kind of a flash in the pan. It was just temporary. But it illustrates how difficult it is to live in Northern Ireland right now, given all of this drama that's happening around them. And also the lengths that the European Union is apparently willing to go to deal with this vaccine shortage issue. So to answer your question, that's what's going on with Brexit.
So still on that rocky journey. It was pretty unfortunate timing to have COVID and Brexit at the same time.
Yeah, that's putting it mildly. COVID was a very well-timed event. I'm not saying it was artificial. Don't read too much into that. But just like in terms of cosmic accidents, this one had disproportionate impact because of its timing, and not just in terms of like Brexit. It happened right in the middle of the U.S. election, for example. It happened right when the Russian government was trying to have that constitutional referendum. It happened in China during the trade negotiations with the United States, and threw that all off kilter. Everybody has been put out. Almost everywhere there was something going on that was very sensitive, and that COVID just kind of wrecked.
So we've got Russia, Myanmar, the U.S., Britain, and Ireland. How's Africa doing?
Neuro, I have bad news for you.
Uh-oh.
They've still got locusts in Africa.
Still locusts?
They've still got a locust plague in Africa.
Did we run out of ducks?
I guess so. Yeah, I think the war in Ethiopia ended up kind of exacerbating it, because they'd been on track to kind of deal with it. At least that's what I've been reading. But then the war in Tigray province happened, which I think we talked about that last time, or recently anyway. And that set them back a little bit. So yeah, there's still locusts in Africa, unfortunately. I think there's also a famine in southern Africa, but I haven't heard as much about that. Madagascar was in the news. Or no, not Madagascar, the other one. Mozambique. There we go. Mozambique has been in the news. There hasn't been a cartoon movie made with the name Mozambique. So yet. I tend to mix it up with Madagascar. Yeah, Mozambique was in the news because the northern province has been having problems with an Islamist insurgency. So they've been attacking government forces and trying to extort international mining corporations that are there. Mm-hmm. I don't think it's really tied into broader Middle Eastern Islamist insurgency type activity. It seems to be mostly local. And from what I've read, it has more to do with the lack of legitimacy for the state. The state has very little presence on the ground in a lot of Mozambique, rather. And the mining firms in northern Mozambique signed deals with the government that were very favorable to the mining firms and to the government, but which did not really favor the local province that they were operating in much. So there's kind of a feeling in northern Mozambique that the government doesn't really give a shit about them, and that they might as well try to get some money directly from the mining company by way of extortion, rather than just sort of waiting around and getting screwed over and being poor off their ass. So the Mozambique government has been trying to deal with that and has been asking for help. I don't know how much they've actually gotten. Mozambique is not exactly a strategically located or strategically important country in Africa, so I don't think that they've gotten a lot of attention. Not sure what's going on in South Africa. I haven't heard anything from them in a while. I think it's been pretty quiet. Egypt was doing some Mediterranean war exercises with military exercises, rather, with Greece. That has to do with that whole East Mediterranean imbroglio that Turkey started. I'm still waiting to see what the Biden administration does with Turkey. They've kind of been biding their time, so to speak, with that issue. Let's see, what else is in it? Libya's been doing better. There was a settlement reached between the two warring factions in Libya to try to create a unity government. But it's not really clear to me whether or not either will actually take it seriously. It wasn't really a binding agreement. It was more of a effort to try to hold new elections and build a new government. But, one or the other faction may or may not actually implement that. I think the more important part of the deal was both sides agreeing to try to restrain their respective foreign backers. But we'll see. We'll see. Hopefully it works out. Libya's been a mess for a while now. But both factions have been around a while, and they've very much consolidated their power in their respective areas. So it's going to be difficult to build trust between them at this point. So that was some event there. Central African Republic has been having some violence. It's not unusual for them. There was I don't remember exactly what the course of events was. There was a corrupt government, and then there was an uprising. And I think it started in the north. For the most part, Central African Republic is a Christian country, but the northern bit is Muslim. So there was some Muslim militias in the north that formed and then overthrew the government. And I think they were called the Salika or something. And people weren't necessarily unhappy with seeing the government go, but then the militias, it's a militia. It's not government sanctioned. They kind of ran around, extorted businesses, hurt people, etc. So there was anti-Salika militias were formed. I don't think they ever had a name. They were just called anti-Salika. And they formed up and kicked the Salika out of the central part of the country and sent them back to the northern part of the country. But since then, there's been internecine communal violence between Muslims in the north and Christians in the south and their respective militia groups. And just recently, they had an election where another politician was elected, and somehow he was perceived as being corrupt or illegitimate. And so there's been mass protests. Well, not mass there's not really enough people for mass anything. It's Central African Republic. It's a very small country in terms of population. But the anti-Salika militia has been mobilizing to basically fight this guy that just won the election because they see him as illegitimate. So there's been even more violence than usual in the Central African Republic. I've kind of been paying more attention to it because I was reading that Russia has been establishing some influence in the country. There's apparently a Russian firm that's tied to the Wagner group that's been engaging in mining operations in Central African Republic. And they've also brought along some Wagner mercenaries to help protect the assets. So there's some suspicion that maybe the Wagner group is establishing business ties to the government in Central African Republic so that the Russian government can have some influence there. I'm not sure what they'll do with it. I mean, of all the countries to have influence in, a broken, failed state like Central African Republic is probably low on the list of countries you would want to have influence in. But for whatever reason, the Russians are making an effort at it. It could just be for the money. The Wagner group has close ties to the political elite in Russia, so it may be that they're just trying to generate revenue for the ruling patronage network so that they can hold together. Russian economy has not been doing great over the past 5 years. So it may be that the patronage network is hurting for cash. If you want to hold together a patronage network, you got to patronize people. And if you want to do that, you got to have money. So they may be looking for ways to generate extra revenue to try to kind of prop up that network. Oh, actually, this was something I read about today. Did you hear about the Ebola outbreak in Guinea?
Chat was just talking about that.
Oh,
Maybe not
really?
in Guinea, but no, I have not heard about that.
Yeah, that just happened. I was reading about that just a couple hours ago. Apparently, in the country of Guinea, the government has declared an epidemic, although only 3 people have died so far. So it's still, I think, in its early stages. So they might be able to contain it. And they actually, in the last Ebola outbreak, there was a vaccine developed. So we actually do have that now. And as a result, they kind of do have a viable solution this time rather than just trying to contain it through traditional quarantine measures. So they've been trying to rush production and delivery of Ebola vaccines to Guinea to try to deal with that. It kind of made me wonder whether or not vaccine production might be so tied up with producing COVID vaccines that maybe they might have trouble getting an Ebola vaccine. I wasn't really sure about that. If there were, I would suspect Ebola vaccine would be prioritized, because as bad as COVID is, it's not any Ebola. I think everybody has an interest in keeping that contained. So ideally, they're able to get that vaccine out, and hopefully they can kind of contain the spread of that before it gets out too much. If it turns into a big international thing like it was back in the day, it's going to be a problem. we've already got so many problems with COVID. I can't imagine how much worse it would be with Ebola instead. Although I don't think we would have nearly as many problems with people worried about the government lying about it. I think Ebola is sufficiently dangerous that most people would be pretty on board with the government treating it as a health emergency and taking strong action in turn. Although I could be wrong. I've certainly been surprised by any number of inexplicable behavior over the past 4 years. So who's to say? Maybe we'll have Ebola zombies.
Using COVID as a contrast, Ebola is way, way, way more lethal, but it's less contagious.
Oh, yeah.
I think you have to really be up on somebody or something that is infected with Ebola to contract it, whereas with COVID, it spreads a lot more easily. And that's kind of the relationship with any virus or bacteria or whatever is. If it needs a host to propagate itself, then killing your host is not a good move.
Yeah. Yeah, the problem they had in West Africa is that they have a ritual that they do when they want to bury somebody who died. And the ritual kind of exposes people to the body. And the body is still contagious in the early hours after death. And so it was spreading around apparently a lot in that way.
Mm-hmm.
I think in Islamic cultures, Islam requires burial of the dead pretty quickly after death. So, it's not like the body has time to kind of, just sort of die and become inhospitable to the virus. So they get a fresh, a newly dead body, and it's still sufficiently contagious that people can get infected. And so the government tried to warn people about that, but a lot of people thought the government was lying for some reason.
Mm-hmm.
They kind of suspected the government was up to something. I don't know how long that lasted before they kind of changed their mind, but yeah, I remember that was one of the major reasons it got so bad back in the outbreak, 10 years ago, whenever it was. There's more violence in the Sahel, but that's not new. I don't know that it really is substantive enough to warrant too much discussion. It's just sort of the usual herders versus agricultural settlers type violence that's been going on a while. There's been some Islamist violence, but that also has been happening for a while. So nothing too unusual, really, in the Sahel anyway. I think the Tanzanian government tried to do something. The Tanzanian government has been denying that COVID is too much of a problem. So they're kind of one of those governments. I don't think it's doing them any favors. I kind of wonder if they aren't doing it just because they don't have the resources to really do much about it. Because it is a poorer country. So it might be that they're just trying to get people to be risk tolerant.
Is Brazil still doing that? Because I think Bolsonaro was downplaying it for a long time.
Yeah, he was, but I think the actual health institutions in the Brazilian government were kind of taking it relatively more seriously.
Hmm.
Because I remember there was a kind of a showdown between the head of the health ministry and Bolsonaro, because the head of the health ministry didn't want to downplay it, and I think he ended up getting removed on account of that, which was not a popular move, if I recall. But yeah, I think Bolsonaro in general is kind of sticking to his guns. I think there was actually an article I read about Bolsonaro not too long ago. There was a question about how Bolsonaro would respond to Donald Trump losing office, because he had been pretty buddy buddy with the US government under Trump. So there was some question about how he would adjust Brazilian foreign policy in response to the emergence of the Biden administration. And it seems like the answer is nothing. It seems like he's just going to keep doing the same thing. So it doesn't look like the friendly relations between the United States and Brazil that were built up in the Trump years are going to survive Trump's loss of power.
Mm-hmm.
Just what that means substantively in terms of foreign policy is anybody's guess. I don't know that Trump's friendship with Bolsonaro ever really amounted to much in terms of tangible policy. They just kind of supported each other politically in terms of political rhetoric.
Yeah, that is something that has changed with Biden coming through. A lot of this is just the leaders talking to each other rather than substantive policy that actually changes something. So
Yeah.
Trump being very friendly with, say, Kim Jong-un and Vladimir Putin, and then Biden having what was reported as a harsh telephone call with Putin, which it's not really a thing that got pushed through. It's not any military move per se, but it's more of like a gesture of his stance.
Yeah.
And the stance of the U.S. will have flipped pretty substantially with Trump to Biden. I think Europe is going to be looking at us a lot more favorably just because of that switch. Russia less so. China, I don't know. But yeah, stuff like Trump and Bolsonaro is kind of like they're both the same tough guy style of leadership, so they get along well in a social capacity of just two people in a room.
Yeah. Yeah, but in terms of something like Venezuela, and in terms of, coordinating on other regional issues, like drugs or whatever, I don't think much will change in that regard. They'll probably still cooperate on those individual issues.
Mm-hmm.
I just don't think that the Brazilian government is going to be quite so gung ho about aligning with the United States, so openly. But beyond that, I don't know that there's going to be a big change. Yeah, Venezuela had elections recently, for what little that may be worth. They were not exactly free and fair elections. But at this point, the opposition is sufficiently disorganized and demoralized that they really weren't able to mount any kind of coherent defense. I think they're still boycotting. I think that was kind of their go-to move, which I think was the wrong move in the grand scheme of things. But that's what they're still doing. But even so, they haven't been able to do anything else to really challenge the government's authority. So the significance of the recent elections is that the Venezuelan ruling party, I can't remember the name of it, but basically the Chavista party, they're going to have control of the National Assembly again, which is the first time in years that they've had that. The last time they had elections in which the opposition actually ran, the opposition picked up a majority in the National Assembly and they controlled the legislature. So the Venezuelan government then responded by organizing a constitutional convention. And what they did is that they gave the constitutional convention, in which delegates from different parts of Venezuela were sent in order to negotiate the new constitution. They gave that assembly the power of the legislature, basically stripping it from the actual legislature. So for several years now, there's basically been two legislatures in Venezuela, the National Assembly and the Constitutional Assembly. And for a while, that kind of gave the opposition-ruled National Assembly some credibility as a viable, alternative to the government. And that led to the head of the National Assembly, I think his name was Guaido, kind of announcing that he was the actual president. There was some obscure procedural rule that the National Assembly used in order to appoint Guaido as the new president. But of course, the Venezuelan executive branch didn't recognize the legitimacy of that. So in effect, there was two presidents. The state apparatus recognized the authority only of the Chavista president, the sitting president. So it didn't end up meaning anything in the long run. It was more symbolic than anything. But technically, it gave some legitimacy to the legal challenge to the legitimacy of the Venezuelan government. Now that's over, because now the opposition lost, a lot of seats. Basically, the ruling party has the majority in the National Assembly again. So now they control the only other significant body of the government that they had not previously controlled. So it's a unified state now. The Chavista party controls the executive branch, the legislature, and basically the judiciary at this point. Kind of makes me wonder what they're going to do with the Constitutional Assembly. Is that still around? I never read that they shut it down, but I don't think that they ever, I don't know. I don't remember what they did with that, what ultimately came of that. But regardless, the ruling party has more power now than it's ever had before. Although it's not substantially more than they had before. Just on paper, technically, they're more powerful than they were before. So it remains to be seen just what the significance of that is. I don't think they'll really change policy. I don't think they're going to do anything they weren't doing before. Really, the ball is in the opposition's court. But like I said, they're just so disorganized and demoralized that it's not clear that they're going to be able to mount any substantive resistance. So the path is pretty much clear for Venezuela to become an official one-party state if the Chavista party really wants it to, but it's just not clear if they do.
We'll see.
We'll see. I did read that they actually got rid of their price controls, which is actually a pretty smart move, because that was one of the main things that really ruined the Venezuelan economy. Obviously, oil prices were a big factor, but price controls really made it a lot worse than it needed to be. Mm-hmm. So I think late last year, they got rid of a lot of price controls. So I'm kind of eager to see what effect that has, because hypothetically, that could mean that there's actual economic recovery in Venezuela now. Oh, I also read that Cuba is going to open up a lot of their economy to private business. Not foreign investment, mind you, but previously there was only like a handful of parts of the economy. There was only a handful of types of businesses that you could own privately outside the control of the state. But they've significantly expanded the categories of economic activity in which private businesses can operate. So it's going to be really interesting to see what impact that has. That could significantly help out a lot of people in the Cuban economy. So some nascent liberalization, basically, in some of these countries.
There is a concept that has been discussed and to an extent implemented in Germany, which is reconsidering the work week and how much time people should or ought to work. Some people are looking at a 4-day work week per se. With COVID, it seems like it's putting pressure on us making general changes so that we're more interconnected through the internet and less so through the conventional, like driving to stores and the mall and things like this. So when it comes to job loss, I feel like that puts pressure on people to get a 9 to 5 days a week kind of a job so they can pay rent. But that trend over time could be something that we let go of and we say, well, maybe it's acceptable to work 4 days a week to pull your weight in society. Like you mentioned, in the United States, there's very much a libertarian, if you want stuff, go get it for yourself mindset. So I would think a lot of people would respond negatively toward handouts per se, but just shifting that norm back a few notches from like working yourself to death to what is an acceptable amount of work throughout the week. I don't know if there's been any legislative change on this front, but the conversation seems to have started.
I haven't seen anything. And I don't think it would really play out like that if it did. Because I think what we've seen over time is that they're just going to gradually introduce something like a UBI. Because I was thinking about this, we basically already have limited UBI. Like if you retire, you get Social Security. If you're disabled, you get disability payments. So there are certain categories of person in which we already have UBI for, in which we have some basic baseline payment that we just give people. So I think what we might see is just a slow expansion of the categories of people who qualify for that. And then maybe over time, we'll creep closer to UBI without ever really quite having it in full. We'll kind of, what's the word I want? I can't remember. It's been too long. My math skills have atrophied neuro. Well, basically, it'll just get to be where something like maybe you only have to work 20 years, and then you qualify for a base UBI payment.
Oh, right. Basically,
So-
you're like, you change what qualifies as a senior citizen, and at that point, they unlock those benefits. So instead of it being maybe 65, it could be 55, and so on.
Yeah. So we'll expand the categories of people who qualify to the point where maybe when you turn 20, you're expected to start working, and then you're on the clock. And then once you've worked for some set amount of time and kind of paid your dues, then they say, okay, you qualify for a base payment, and you can either keep working and make more money, or you can retire and do what you want, or whatever. So that saves money because a lot of people would not be getting payments then. But then eventually you do have that UBI. So you maybe don't have the comfort of getting the payment during a certain age, but you at least can look forward to it. And maybe that helps ease some of the anxiety of not knowing what's going to happen to you in the future. It makes planning for the future a little bit easier. So that could be more politically viable than just saying, let's spend trillions of dollars just giving money to everybody. Something else they could do in this vein is that they could, instead of giving everybody payments, they just give coupons that you can pay on certain things. So we actually already do this with food stamps in the United States. For those of you who are not from the United States or maybe aren't familiar with this, food stamps are a food program in the United States in which people with, I think it's low incomes, basically poor people, can receive a coupon from the government, or coupons rather from the government, that they can use to buy certain foods from grocery stores. And the grocery stores accept the coupons as payment because they know that they can redeem them from the government for money. So it's basically just a program for poor people to afford food. So we could see something like that, where certain goods and services are paid for by the government, like probably healthcare at some point, food, etc. And the government will pay for that for certain parts of the population that are considered to qualify. So in that sense, people are kind of getting the benefit of something like a UBI, because if you get a UBI, you're probably using it to pay for essentials. You're using it to pay for food, shelter, healthcare, etc. So rather than just giving money in general, you can give it to you can give money that's not always going to be spent. If you can only spend it on healthcare, then that means you're going to sit on it for a while. So the government can save money in that way because it's not always being spent. Like a $500 payment, let's say, if you have a $500 UBI, that $500 is definitely getting spent every month, most likely. So that's going to be really expensive for the government. But if the government only pays for your healthcare or whatever thing, like with food stamps, that's not necessarily always being spent. It's being spent on a narrow set of goods for what's probably going to be a narrow part of the population. So it's a little bit cheaper. So that's a little confused on my part. I apologize. But the idea here is just to explain how you could have a program that approaches UBI but is not full on UBI, in which people's needs are kind of being met peripherally. Asymptotically, that's the word I was trying to think of. So you can have a pseudo UBI program that asymptotically approaches UBI status without ever actually needing it. I suspect that's the way it's going to play out over the long run.
Just don't call it UBI. If you give people all these benefits, just make sure that they know that this is not a handout, and then it'll work.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, I could see that happening in the United States, because I think the full-on idea of actual UBI would not be politically popular with a lot of people to the point where they would stop it from happening. But if you justify little things, we've already justified food stamps and Social Security and whatnot, and we'll probably have some kind of healthcare program that helps people. I suspect healthcare will also play out like this in the United States, where the government will probably pay for something like cancer treatment, help pay for insulin for diabetics, stuff like that. I think individual maladies might get paid for by the U.S. government. I think that's much more likely than a full-on program that just covers everything. It's much more politically viable if you do it that way rather than a NHS-style program. And then over time, it'll just accumulate until we have something like a de facto national healthcare program.
Mm-hmm.
Do I have time to get some water?
Yes, sir.
All right. Sorry for the interruption, but I ran out.
Hydration is key. No need to apologize for drinking water.
Thank you.
I just had a major defeat in this endless space battle. I picked one of the pacifist races where they're like tree people. And they start out on their home world and they're very peaceful and just chilling, and people are having space battles up above. So they say, I guess we need to be spacefaring. It's kind of the anchor point here. And I did focus pretty hard on economy and production, but I didn't get military early enough. So I'm being punished by a mistake right now of not having unlocked any of the fighting ships. All I have is a scout ship and a colony ship. So if we're like analyzing this Endless Space 2 match, which I'm playing, it's kind of like Civ, but in space. I should have gotten at least a couple of the military talents earlier on. People in the chat are all hyped up about Bitcoin stuff. I did have a conversation with Triforce Trader last Sunday about the GME memes and things like that. He trades as his full-time job, so that was a really cool getting a bit of info from not officially an expert, because you have to have certain tests and forms filled out and all this, but someone who actually trades talking about it. It's been a bit of a meme storm, pretty funny. It's got a lot of stick it to the man energy of a bunch of people punishing a firm for shorting GameStop stock, and then sort of getting maybe a bit of a delusion of grandeur that they can change the entire landscape of trading. Triforce was saying, and you can check this out in the Neuro podcast, that basically it wasn't quite the meme to end all memes that's going to change trading as we know it. This is something that has happened in the past, but the visibility of the GameStop meme was way higher because a lot of people use Reddit. So they hear about a subreddit deciding to all trade some particular stock. You can relate to that. I browse a subreddit. Okay, that's cool. Maybe the people can make changes and things like this, but it's all part of the overall strategy game. And they made a good play, but the individuals who are making these plays are not career traders. It's more just people who have some money. So a reminder there would be smart, be responsible, keep your trading funds, whatever, separate from your living expenses. Don't put yourself at risk. But yeah, this is a thing that has happened before, and it will happen again. The stock market is a pretty risky, dicey place. We just did a quick TLDR of the GameStop memes and that kind of thing. I have a supporter of the stream who trades, and he creates educational content for it and stuff, so I talked with him about it.
Triforce Trader?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I saw that. That was really cool. I was pretty curious about that myself.
Mm-hmm.
That was an exciting little piece of history.
Yeah. It was a refreshing change of pace, too, because a lot of the COVID news is just sad.
Yeah.
And then you get this one, and it's like, man, this is dank. Like, are we sticking it to the man? Is the 99% making a play against the 1%? Kind of, yes. One firm in particular did go down something like 50% of their overall money, because they do have to pay back whatever the change was
Yeah.
when they tried to short. So
Yeah, Melvin Capital.
yeah, those people in particular got fucked over, but you wouldn't say that all hedge funds in general are now messed up because they do their research. Basically, they didn't respect scouting Reddit enough, but that's something that could be done ahead of time. So if a big post is going around, everyone buy this particular stock, it's not hard to make a Reddit account and just follow that account and say, okay, they're going to do this now. Feels a little bit like StarCraft, where you've got people making plays and then people scouting what other people are doing so they can make counter plays. What a game.
Yeah. Yeah, it's I just really wasn't sure how to frame it when it was happening, because I couldn't tell if people were just being really smart and utilizing new technology to do something that wasn't possible before, or if people were just being really stupid and falling for some kind of social media con. Like, I couldn't figure it out. It's just I'm not familiar enough with trading to really make the judgment, so I was trying to do some reading to try to get an idea. So it was pretty useful to listen to Triforce Trader talk about it in that regard, since he has a lot more experience in the industry.
Yep. Even if you think you might know what's going on, it's nice to just hear what the experts are saying about it, because sometimes their opinion is different from the standard meme.
Oh, yeah. I was a little, my first impression, my uninformed, uneducated first impression, was that it was just day trader shenanigans. So I didn't really think much of it at first, because it just seemed to be Wall Street bets being Wall Street bets. I don't know how familiar you are with the Wall Street bets subreddit, Neuro. Have you spent any time there?
I visited briefly. I don't really know too much about it. So I know that I'm a noob with trading, so I don't really want to throw my own money at it.
That's very wise. That's very wise.
Yeah, some people ask about like crypto and stuff. I don't even mess with it.
Yeah. Yeah, the culture of that subreddit is not such that you would trust them with money. So when I first heard that they were behind the shenanigans, my first impression was pretty negative. I just kind of assumed it was bullshit, because they describe themselves as basically like the 4chan of finance. And if you actually read through, the posts and stuff, everybody refers to themselves as a quote-unquote autistic retard. Yeah. So it didn't really lend much confidence to me that they actually kind of knew what they were doing. Yeah,
they don't usually do the whole PC thing, and that's a different just cultural. I don't know if I would call it a battle, but it's definitely a spectrum right now where certain people are on the forefront of trying to be as inclusive, as positive and uplifting as possible, and then you've got the edgy end of the internet where it was almost a rite of passage to just be offensive, and that was a way that you demonstrate that you were a part of this internet culture and club. And it seems like Wall Street Bets definitely has some of that energy to it.
Oh, yeah.
With Twitch, we're pretty much on the opposite end where as a company, they're really trying to be as inclusive and empowering and uplifting as possible and really work against a lot of the old school kind of gamer bro culture it was present in Han, and there's still a lot of it in Dota, League of Legends, these online games with very aggressive and angry people who just kind of accept that as a status quo of this is how online games are. And that tug of war continues on in every Twitch stream and in every chat between the edgelords and the wholesome memes. Which side are you on? Or are we all a mixture of the two in some sense? Yeah, they don't really, to go to Wall Street Bets, they don't really talk about it in the same terminology as career traders, from what I could tell. They would say stuff like, it's very catchphrasey, like diamond hands, which means hold on to this stock even if it seems like you should let go of it. To the moon, just like a bunch of different taglines that made it really dank and funny, but you wouldn't really talk about it that way. Like Triforce doesn't use those phrases when he's talking about what he does.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that aspect of the event, the way that they hyped it kind of reminded me of gold. Because if
Mhm.
you ever watch like I don't know if you've ever watched like Fox Business News or anything, but a lot of the commercials are basically just pushing gold.
Mhm.
And the way that the gold trade works is that the less confidence people have in the economy, the easier it is to convince them that they should buy gold, because gold is kind of a safe investment. It's good if you're afraid of inflation or something. It's just a safe space you can kind of put your money in.
Mhm.
So there's kind of a tendency on the part of gold traders to try to kind of fear monger, basically. They try to make the argument that things are not very safe, that things are very unstable, and wouldn't it be nice if your money could be in a safe place like gold?
Mhm.
And that kind of hype, that sort of energy is kind of what I saw in the Wall Street Bets move here in
Mhm.
terms of GameStop, which was another thing that made me very suspicious of it. Yeah, inflating a bubble in a commodity like that, it's not too hard if you can just find the right button to push. Manipulating people just requires knowing how they think and what motivates them. And if you can kind of figure that out, then you can manipulate a stock or a commodity pretty easily, from what I've seen anyway. I would be interested in seeing what your trading friend would have to say about it.
Yeah, the most impactful thing that this storm kind of points toward is regulation. Should different people be allowed to trade in different ways? Should the firms be restricted? Should the individuals be restricted? And Robinhood, so ironically named company, was preventing people through their phone app of trading from purchasing GameStop stock when this was happening, which is very silly. And their reviews got tanked big time. It's them taking the side of the firms, which is the opposite of the character Robin Hood. I don't know if anyone's heard of Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, but the character concept was stealing from the rich and giving to the poor. And then the phone app is preventing the poor from making a play against the rich.
Yeah.
So what does this change about trading moving forward? We'll see. Maybe nothing, maybe something.
Probably nothing. I suspect the industry will fight tooth and nail to avoid any kind of substantive regulation. I think they like it having been. I think that they like it having. They like it wide open.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, it's kind of a cowboy culture, from what I've read of it. I seem to remember back in the 1920s, there was a huge stock market bubble that was inflated with the introduction of retail trading. I don't know enough about the history of the stock market to know whether retail trading was really a thing before that. But retail trading rather, was one of the contributing factors to the Great Depression and the stock market crash that helped lead to it. Because a lot of people, there weren't really a lot of regulations around retail trading. It was really easy to get into the market, and because of that, there was a lot of speculation, and there wasn't even really a lot of restrictions on margin trading. You could very easily borrow money and then just invest it, and then gamble, basically hoping that you could make enough back to cover your borrowings. So that being the case, a lot of the regulations that we have now were specifically implemented to protect retail traders. So it's interesting now to see people complaining about some similar mechanisms in place. I guess Robinhood doesn't count because that's an individual firm. They shut down trading themselves. But protections, there are similar such protections in place to stop retail traders from getting burned. And that generally means limiting trading to certain institutional investors when it comes to certain kinds of assets, and stopping trading in the stock market or stopping trading in a given stock. A lot of times that's done to protect traders. So I think I remember that happening back in like 2008, a fair amount.
Mm-hmm.
So some of these restrictions in place that people complain about, some of them were actually implemented in the first place to protect retail traders from swings in the market, from market manipulations, etc. So further regulation would kind of have to go in a different direction then. Because I think what they want, what people asking for regulation now want, is to have it be safer uh, for retail traders. well, maybe not safer per se, but to have more access to the market, so that something like Robinhood can't stop them from trading. But previous regulations back in the 1930s and 40s were mostly about stopping trading in order to stop people from losing too much money. So it would be a different dichotomy this time, basically. I hope I'm not talking too much out of my ass. If so, I apologize. But I thought it was interesting the way people were talking about regulation and how it differed from the last time that there was a lot of talk about regulation after the Great Depression.
And so it goes. The epic drama of our time.
It may not be too much of a big deal in terms of losses, because one of the things I was kind of wondering was whether or not people were going to lose a lot of money and feel burned, and maybe they would blame Wall Street bets or something. But I think from what I read on the subreddit is that a lot of people were not investing that much money, that it was maybe just like a couple $100s. And for them, they weren't even really expecting to make any money. They just wanted to kind of jump on the bandwagon and kind of hurt a hedge fund somehow.
Yeah, so it spiked up really high after a bunch of people bought. So if you bought early, then you had the potential to make gains if you sold at the peak. But then it fell again, which people predicted it would. And then if you bought when it was expensive, like closer to the peak, then you will have lost money because you can't sell it for as much as you bought it for.
Yeah, exactly.
Which means you go back to that recommendation of don't use your rent money to trade.
Yeah.
Don't use your rent money to go to the casino and gamble. Your rent money is rent money. If you get a plus somewhere and you're green for the next several amount of time, use your own discretion, then you could have some fun expenses. But if you're not a career trader, it is just a risk. It's kind of like rolling the dice.
Yeah. So that was pretty exciting.
Mm-hmm. It's pretty similar to poker, where it's deceptively difficult. The difference between poker and StarCraft is a new player at StarCraft will never beat a pro player, but a new player at poker could win a hand against a pro at poker just based on RNG. And you could make a mistake every street and still technically win, which means that people who are bad at poker can sometimes think that they're actually good. Same thing with trading, where maybe you made a good bit of money on Bitcoin or some random thing, and you fancy yourself someone who has an intuition for these kind of things, when really intuition will be tested over a large volume of outcomes, not just on like one lucky bet that you had.
Yeah, that's my impression as well. There's a lot of, there's a lot of skill involved, but there's also an element of luck too.
Yep. It's both. The luck evens out the longer that you're putting hands in. So it's like a good player becomes more and more obvious in the tens of thousands of hands of poker, and it's less obvious after 100 hands. But there are some clues, like just to give a little rundown of some bad poker moves. People who call a lot, generally speaking, are bad players because it doesn't represent any strength of your hand. If you do have a legit good hand at the start, pre-flop, you should start to build the pot pre-flop by placing a bet, typically. Even if you're worried about your opponents thinking that you have a strong hand, strong hands happen. And if you represent strong hands with legit bets, that also means that you can bluff with bad hands by betting the same way that you did with strong hands. So good players tend to be betting or folding pre-flop. Bad players tend to be calling because they just want to see the outcome of the flop because it's exciting. You get to see if your hand connected. And there's a really strong human drive to just witness that outcome. There's a lot of excitement. So people who are going to play poker from a gambling perspective, the flop is a big moment. So you call to get to the flop if you're a gambler. If you're a pro and you have a bad hand at the start, you want to get out as fast as possible. You want to fold your bad hands right away. For a rough estimate of the hands I folded when I was playing full time, you can fold anywhere between like 80 and 90% of your starting hands because they're just not great. You've got your pairs, you've got your high cards that are pretty nice, your sequenced cards to hit a straight and that kind of thing. If you have a good chance to hit something good, then sure, you can play the hand, but bad hands, you just don't even want to get invested in that. What are the signs for being a good or bad trader? Couldn't tell you. I'm bad.
Yeah, I remember you guys were working on that for a long time.
Mm-hmm. It was a good wake-up call for me because I went from being pretty successful in a few different categories and fancying myself a skilled gamer, but not realizing that games can have dramatically different skills, and the skills required to be good at poker are very different from the skills required to be good at World of Warcraft, StarCraft, whatever. So you should treat it like you're a complete novice because you are. I went into it very kind of elitist and headstrong of like, oh yeah, we can crush this. And then after setting up that account and getting in some online games in Canada, I was playing for pennies, but I was getting crushed. And I had the question mark of like, am I actually bad? And I had a very depressing and sad day. I went back to the hostel I was staying at and went to bed super early because I was so defeated and crushed. And I resolved that the next morning I would wake up and only read poker forums and see what was up. And I opened it up and I realized I didn't even know what the words meant. I was a total noob. So I began by learning the vocabulary. So you could start with that method, I think, just for any game of skill or domain where you don't have knowledge, is for an initial step, learn what the words mean. Figure out how they're discussing the situations they're faced with, because usually, because they do it for so often, they're going to have fairly efficient and accurate ways of portraying the situation. So you can kind of tell who's good or bad at poker by how they talk about a hand. You can tell who's good or bad at StarCraft by how they talk about a match. Probably the same thing with trading.
Yeah, sounds like it. Skills tend to have similar processes of learning them and climbing the learning curve.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. Did we have time for... We actually had some questions left over from last time. Did we want to get into those?
We may have had some questions from this time too.
I see one.
Sure, we could hit that because I think the viewer's still there, and then we could hit some from last time.
Okay. All right, let's see. So this question was, Agent Smith, do you have any ideas, suggestions on preventing such a drastic policy tone change every few years when the president changes? Not really. I mean, pretty much the only thing you can do there is push more policy making into something like the civil service, basically the bureaucracy. So if it's being professionally done, regardless of who the civilian leadership is, then you can have more continuity. But then policy making isn't being set as much by civilian leaders who are representative of their constituencies. And in turn, policy making is less representative. So you do lose some control then over policy making. And I don't think many people in the United States right now think that the government want to give up any representative control over policymaking. I think, if anything, people think too much control is being wielded by bureaucratic agencies and forces of one sort or another. So that's not really going to work, not really politically viable. I mean, something else you can do is just to try to make it more difficult to change policy, such that the wild swings from one administration to another don't really manifest in substantially different policy making. But then you have the same problem. You're just losing control. The people who vote a new president in probably want some kind of substantive change, and if they can't get it, they're going to be very upset, and that kind of brings into question the legitimacy of the government. So yeah, I don't think there's really any good way to do that. I mean, fundamentally, it's more of a problem with people than with government. That's really the case with a lot of problems in developed countries right now. There's just a lot of differences in a fundamental policy preferences and personal preferences that are manifesting in tension between different groups of people and different political parties and whatnot. So that's the real underlying reason that you have such drastic policy tone changes in the first place. And that's really what you have to try to address if you want to try to fix that. You know, you have to try to work more to try to get people to reach some kind of broad-based consensus on the direction the country should go in terms of certain policies. If you can do that, then the differences between political parties are not so great, and you don't see as many dramatic differences between them in terms of policy making. So that's the only real solution you can have to that doesn't involve significantly making it more difficult for democratic expression, you know, for representative government. Let's see. So that was the question we had today. I think a lot of these had to do with the riot around January 6th, because that was around the last time we did this.
We also addressed the GameStop meme.
Yeah, we got the GameStop thing. So let's see. Trump denounced the violence way too late and said the criminals would be prosecuted, but what do you think he would have done if somehow it had been a successful coup? Do we really think he'd say anything similar afterward? I don't think it ever had any real chance of being successful. And I don't know that it was ever even really a coup attempt. I think he just wanted to, I think if anything, he just wanted to scare them into somehow voting such in a way that would have allowed him to stay in office. At that point, that was extremely unlikely, so it was always a long shot. So I don't think it ever had any real chance of actually overthrowing the government. If it had succeeded, then I think it would have meant that they would have voted to not certify the electoral college results, which could have thrown the election to state legislatures, which hypothetically could have resulted in a Trump victory. So hypothetically that could have worked, but it would have resulted in a gigantic political shit show, suffice to say. But even if it had gone to state legislatures, I don't know that it's inevitable they would have voted for him. I think a lot of people would have voted on principle rather than on partisanship, as strange as that may sound at this juncture. But as far as how he would have responded, I'm sure he would have been delighted. I don't know. He's never struck me as being like a strategist or like a complicated guy. He just kind of does what he wants in order to get what he wants. Let's see. Next question. What does Agent Smith think about the Japanese Trump supporters marching in Tokyo? Had you heard of that, Nura?
I have not. I heard about them, I think, supporting him, but I wasn't sure what it was about.
Yeah, they came out in support of him. What was it? Was like during or after the election, or I don't remember exactly when it happened, but there was a whole parade of Japanese people just with like a Trump garb, you know, MAGA hats, all that kind of thing, and they were just marching in support of Donald Trump. It was a very surreal thing to see. I think we've actually talked a little bit about, because I remember like last year, at some point, we had somebody ask how Donald Trump is perceived by people in different countries around the world. And in East Asia, he actually has more support than you might think. And that has pretty much all to do with China. Because the US's China policy under the Obama administration was pretty wishy-washy. You know, the Obama administration said that they wanted to have a stronger presence in East Asia and stand up more to China and to try to contain China more in order to protect allies in the region. But they never really did, or at least not to the point where local governments were ever really satisfied. So a lot of people in East Asia actually really liked that the Trump administration took a strong position on China. They didn't necessarily like that he upended trade relationships. But they did like the fact that he was at least trying to rectify the imbalances in the trade relationship between the United States and China, and was putting a lot of pressure on China. So conservative political forces in East Asia were very happy with that, and they were worried that Biden, if he won, would reverse those gains, those perceived gains. And so there was, an actual parade in Japan, I think Tokyo, of people coming out in support of him because they were worried about China, basically. China's the crux of it. I don't think they're like super excited about his other, the other aspects of his policy platform. Building a wall on the border with Mexico probably doesn't mean much if you're Japanese.
Yeah, so the tough on China approach thing won him a lot of support, basically.
Yeah, that's kind of the gist of it. And that's actually an open question a lot of countries, not only in East Asia, but also in Europe, have about the Biden administration. There actually is a real worry that the Biden administration might be too soft on China. They would really like the United States to kind of take the lead in organizing a common front against perceived Chinese predation in the trade relationship. So whether or not Biden administration does that is kind of an open question. I think the Europeans really did themselves a disservice by signing a trade deal with China not long before Biden took office. That's not really the best signal to send if you're actually looking to cooperate. But I don't know that it'll really make that big a difference. I think the Biden administration really is interested in cooperation, but it's just not clear how much they're willing to invest in that right now, given that they are focused mostly on domestic political considerations. So that's something that we're all watching for. Let's see. Is there evidence that foreign agents from other countries infiltrated the Capitol and potentially looted government assets and or helped to encourage the mob? Not that I'm aware of. I haven't heard anything to that effect. Technically, it is possible. But in order to do that, you would have to have predicted that that was going to happen, and I don't think anybody predicted that that was going to happen. I know that there was people who were predicting that far-right agitators might commit some act of violence, but I don't think anybody saw like a full storming of the Capitol building. That was pretty wild. And if you're a foreign intelligence spy master and you predicted that, then you definitely deserve a pay raise, because I don't think anybody else did.
Well, it was deeply and thoroughly risky for the individuals who broke in, and I don't think that was clear to them, because you guys realize you're signing up for felonies, right? If that was more clear, then I think it may not have happened. You needed some delusions that you're actually going to change something substantive about the government of the country by breaking into this building, as opposed to the most documented set of felonies ever with all the different phones and cameras and things on. So how can you predict that? That's expecting something that's a really big mistake.
Yeah. I mean, the whole thing was just kind of irrational in a lot of ways. And given that fact, I don't see how anybody could have put connected the dots together in a way where you would say, oh yes, this is definitely what's going to happen. I don't think so. And I don't know what they would have really stood to gain by it either. I don't think anybody really wanted more Trump. I mean, who would have done it? The Russians? The Russians don't really care about Trump. They were hopeful that maybe when he took office, that maybe he would take a softer line on Russia, but it became pretty apparent that that just wasn't politically viable.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think the Russians really saw any advantage to it. Maybe the Chinese, because they thought that maybe Trump was doing damage to the U.S., but I've never seen them do something like that before. Generally, when China does foreign intelligence operations, they're either stealing something like information or intellectual property. They're either doing that or they're focusing on some of their own citizens. Because what will happen is some corrupt Chinese politician will flee China in order to avoid prosecution. So then the Chinese intelligence service will kind of go after them and try to pressure them into coming back. Or maybe some Chinese citizen overseas is engaging in some kind of political activity that the party doesn't like. So then some pressure will be brought to bear on them. So that's kind of more what they do. It's very much focused on China, either China's political stability or its industrial policy. But they don't really go out of their way, from what I've seen, to really destabilize other countries. Maybe this is the first time, but I don't think so. It's not really in their wheelhouse, at least not yet. Europe doesn't really have the balls to do something like that, so I don't think they would have done it. Europe is very passive in foreign policy, so I don't really see it. And nobody else really has the capacity. I mean, just it takes planning and experience and, just any number of intangible factors to kind of organize something like that. And there's a lot of risk if you get caught. So between the risk and the difficulty, I don't know that anybody else really has the capacity in terms of actual espionage to really make it happen. So I would not completely rule it out. I can't say that there was no foreign involvement, but I'm really skeptical that there was. It just seems a lot more likely to me that that's just some Americans got really excited and tried to do something. I still don't know entirely what they were trying to do. I don't think all of them were in on it, so to speak. I think different people had different ideas about what was happening and what they were going to achieve. It was just kind of a mess, really. Let's see. So the next question, what is this broadly for the country? Is this what it looks like when democracy is tested by fascism, something else, and withstands, or is this a present threat that goes further than the current administration? I can't imagine this phenomenon sentiment goes away, even if there is a smooth transition henceforth. Yeah, the politics and policy preferences and sentiments that kind of led up to it are definitely still going to be there. But I don't think this was democracy being tested by, fascism. I think this is more like democracy being tested by 4chan. Like, these people are not planners. They're not organized. They're just sort of going on emotion. I think when we talked about it the last time we did this, I tried different framings, like how do you frame something like that? And so I kind of went through a bunch of different possible ways that you could frame the incident. And the one that I think was the most convincing for me personally is that this is basically social media. This is basically the same kind of political activity, that superficial political activity that social media kind of lends itself to. Social media is really good at hyping people and getting them excited, but social media politics is really shit at organizing and actually strategizing. So we've seen a lot of that with stuff like the Occupy protests, where there was a lot of drama and there was a lot of earnest feeling, but not a lot of planning. And so ultimately it just didn't come to anything. So here there was a lot of people who genuinely wanted to try to challenge the government's authority because they thought it was illegitimate, because they thought the election had been stolen, but had no idea how to actually do that. And they somehow convinced themselves that there was something they could do about it, and that maybe if they just express themselves, then it would just kind of happen. There's a lot of that in modern politics, and not just in the United States. The internet really does a good job of fooling people into thinking that they can change the world by being a keyboard warrior.
Yeah, it turns out raw emotional energy is not the best way to make change. You actually need stuff that's actionable and consistent, and really you also need to be able to compromise at least a little bit with the other side. That's part of the wrestling of the House and the Senate, right? Is who gets the majority, because the majority can actually put through policy.
Yeah, there does have to be actual, you do have to actually engage with people who disagree with you. Governance is not about imposing solutions. It's about reaching compromise, because otherwise you're just going to have constant political instability. It just doesn't work. And that fact is just lost on people who are the most excited about politics, because they think that everybody would think like them if they were fully informed. And if they could just talk to them, then they could convince them of that, and they could get their perceived political preferences. But it just doesn't work like that. Just people genuinely have differences in preferred policies, and you can't paper over that by accusing the other side of being ignorant or being disingenuous or whatever. There has to come a point when, beyond political activism, you actually govern. And I don't really see a lot of evidence that the people who are the most interested in change are any good at actual governance. And rectifying that, reconciling that difference is going to be a big challenge for politics in not only the United States, but every developed country. There's going to have to be some kind of breakthrough in broader public understanding of politics in which they recognize that political activism has to translate at some point into effective governance. And once they understand that, I think it'll be easier to get the kinds of compromises we need to get the kinds of consensus politics we need to calm politics down and get something resembling a long-term strategy for how to implement successful policy. But for now, we're not at that stage at all. Right now we're at the stage where the internet and social media has pulled huge numbers of people into politics who were previously not interested in politics. But these same people have not yet really been fully informed about how politics works, how political systems work, how trade-offs are necessary, how governance is difficult, and just all of the little trade-offs that have to be made. We haven't really reached that point yet, and I'm hopeful that we will. I think maybe we're just in a transition phase between the time when technology allows for broad-based involvement in politics and the time when people are aware enough about how politics works and how good politics looks to make good political decisions, good political actions, all of the good stuff that makes successful politics. We're just sort of in the in-between stage between those 2 points. And it's just very ugly and disconcerting and very noisy. But that's the optimistic take. Maybe this is, the digital fall of the republic, as it were. The fall of the republic with Wi-Fi, I think some people describe it as.
I have some optimism and hope in the sense that younger generations are more jacked in with technology and they understand how it works a little bit better, which also means that you can protect yourself somewhat, or at least be able to discern between good information and bad information. That seems to be one of the battles of our time, which is what is good news and what is not, what is fake news. How can we be informed citizens who are actually figuring out what's going on? Because I'm sure people can relate to dinner table conversations that you're having with people, and you can't actually get into the meat of a discussion because you've been given opposite information on the topic. So COVID is a really easy example of this, where some people have been given information that says that it is not as dangerous as people are making it out to be. Other people say that it is more dangerous than people are making it out to be. So it's really tough to figure out what is actually going on. How do I find the good information, and how do I be able to identify the bias of the information that I'm browsing and perusing? And the really, really tough part is the information that has the same bias as you is patting you on the back all the time, which makes it really hard to identify when your side of the aisle is in the wrong, because they're the people who are on your same team. They agree with you on all of these issues. So what they're telling you about this thing in particular, you're going to be inclined to believe them because you've believed them so far, when we can't all be right. We're sharing one country, one planet, and we need to figure out what's going on so that we can find the best way forward. So the age of information, I think one of the main frontiers of battle right now is figuring out signal to noise.
Well said. I would agree. Let's see. We're at 2:43. How are you doing?
Pretty good. We could wrap here soon. We did get two new questions.
Oh, okay. Let's see. So I guess just to kind of finish off the answer to this question, I think this isn't what it looks like when democracy is tested by fascism. I think this is what it's like when democracy is tested by modernity. We have new political and social forces being powered by technological changes and economic changes. And we don't entirely understand them, but I think this is sort of one of the symptoms of the effect those changes are having. So I don't know that precedent is really something we can use to understand this. I really think this is more of a new phenomena that we're going to have to observe and try to understand anew in order to kind of reach a point where we can reach a consensus understanding such that we can deal with it properly. And then the next question was about GameStop and short squeezes. So we pretty much already talked about that, I think.
Mm-hmm. You had the two ones. Question, do you think there's any credibility to the idea that withdrawal from Syria was a favor to Russia? I'm guessing this is the United States withdrawal from Syria.
I don't think we did withdraw from Syria. I think we started to. The Trump administration has announced several times that it wanted to, but it never really did. And then they pulled out a number of troops at the end of the Trump administration, but the U.S. does still have a presence there. So I don't think that we've really withdrawn from Syria. We're still definitely an actor there. In so much as we did withdraw, I don't think it was done as a favor to Russia. I think the Trump administration just legitimately wanted to do that. It's getting the United States out of forever wars was one of the things that Trump ran on when he was running for office. So I think that's just something he's been wanting to do for a while. So I wouldn't see it as a favor. If it had been done as a favor, the U.S. would have gotten something in return, and I don't think Russia has done the U.S. any favors that I can think of over the past couple of years that would qualify. So I don't think there's really any evidence of that. I think if the United States did pull out as a favor for anybody, it would have been as a favor to Erdogan, because Turkey is more important to the United States at this point than Russia is, at least in terms of regional influence. I'm still waiting to see what American policy on Turkey is going to be. I'm really interested in that. That's a really thorny diplomatic problem for the U.S. It's actually it's maybe not as complicated as dealing with the economic relationship with China. That's very, very complicated, but it's still pretty complicated. As far as diplomatic problems that are not economic in nature, Turkish-American relations are probably one of, if not the most difficult relations that the United States has to manage right now. So it's going to be really telling to see, really telling as far as overall Middle Eastern policy, as far as what the U.S. does with Turkey now. Let's see, the next question, any chance Scotland actually becomes independent from the UK? Any chance? Yes, there is some chance, but I don't know how substantive it is. Yeah, they've been pushing pretty hard for that. They got their referendum a couple of years ago, and ultimately there was a no vote. People who did not want to leave won. But part of the strategy for the people who wanted to stay was to promise a bunch of stuff from London. Well, I should say that the British government made promises to the people of Scotland in order to try to get them to vote no, that it did not end up keeping. So that kind of changes things a little bit. Also, the UK had not voted to leave the European Union when that independence referendum was held. They did later, so that also changed things. So at this point, some people in Scotland argue that they should have another independence referendum because there have been so many substantial changes in UK politics since the first referendum was held. The UK voting to leave the European Union, and the British government failing to deliver on promises made before the first independence referendum. And also all the shenanigans that have been happening in British politics generally. The Tories have been quite the circus over the past couple of years. Brexit was not kind to them.
Yeah, that's also a general random card deal of governance, which is sometimes you get dealt a more status quo, peaceful period. Other times you are in a period of upheaval and change. And with COVID, Brexit, big change. Lots of instability and upheaval, lack of certainty, all this. So I would say it's harder to govern there. But the potential gains are greater. It seems like when you have that churn, sometimes a country or a people can adapt in a big way. We'll see how it goes. But yeah, they definitely got a more difficult time period than maybe the previous cycle.
Yeah, the thing about another independence referendum is that the British government has to allow it. The Scottish government can't just do it by itself and have it be legally binding. And the thing right now is that Boris Johnson is pretty conservative in terms of Scotland and in terms of, the British identity, as it were. So I suspect that the Johnson government is going to just reject any attempt to have another independence referendum. They might pretend to entertain the idea of having one in order to humor the Scottish government, but I don't think they'll ever actually do it. I suspect they're just going to string them along in order to keep them quiet. But that's conjecture on my part. Who's to say? I think that's it for questions. Yep, that's all of them. We are caught up.
Nice.
Oh, for the most part. I guess there's that one from... Okay, we technically have several more. Okay, there's a bunch that don't have check marks that go way back to last year, so I guess we're not fully caught up. But as far as the ones from today and the last time, yeah, we're caught up.
Cool. Were there any things you wanted to touch on before we call it?
Let's see. We got most of it. Change and go. There's been some drama in Italian politics, but I don't know that it really changes much. So I don't know that it's really worth talking about too much. I think the big thing in Italy is going to be the upcoming election. I think that's going to be more important than the recent shenanigans in terms of changes in power. There's some minor stuff in Ukraine. Zelensky banned some pro-Russian media, but I don't know how significant that's going to end up being. I still need to get caught up on what happened in Ukraine last year. There was a bunch of... I didn't pay much attention to it, so there was a lot I missed. And there's still ongoing protests in India. It's the farmer protests. But I don't think those are going to matter. It kind of seems like the government is pretty hell-bent on passing that bill. So I suspect that's going to pass regardless. We already talked about a lot of... I was going to talk a little bit about some of the stuff Biden's been doing, but I think we covered most of that. There's not really anything new happening with China. One of the big questions is what the Biden administration does with China. But the only thing that the Biden administration has announced thus far is that they're reviewing China policy, which could take like months. So I suspect they're just going to put that on the back burner until they can kind of strategize and figure out some kind of substantive plan of action. Mm-hmm. So that's something to look forward to, but for now, it's probably not going to be in the news much. The Iranian nuclear deal is another area where people have been curious what the Biden administration is going to do. I kind of predicted that they would probably do much the same as what the Trump administration was doing, and it looks like that's what's happening, because they came out and said that they were not going to just return to the nuclear deal unless the Iranian government gave further concessions. And they also said that the Iranians would have to make concessions first. And the Iranian government predictably rejected that on its face. So it looks like the standoff between the US and Iran is going to continue under the Biden administration. But other than that, I think that's pretty much all I really had of substance today.
One final question that we just got, squeezing it in, was, here we go. What are the probabilities that other countries will, like the US, start claiming to have major election interference in the near future?
Probably not many. And the reason I think it's not going to be many is that it didn't work for Trump. If it had worked for Trump and Trump had stayed in power, you probably would have seen a lot of it. Mm-hmm. But since it didn't work, I don't think so. Yeah, that's kind of a similar phenomena to the war on terror. Before the war on terrorism in the United States after 9/11, nobody really used the word terrorists that much. I mean, it happened, but generally, descriptors like rebels or insurgents or what have you, that was more common. But after 9/11, all of a sudden, every government in the world that had a problem with rebels or dissidents or whomever, all of a sudden, they suddenly started describing them all as terrorists. And they all did it at the same time, so it was really noticeable. So I think there's kind of a bandwagon effect in terms of policymaking in the United States, because a lot of governments think that they can kind of build favor with the United States and control how countries are perceived in the United States by using similar rhetoric to the rhetoric that's used in the United States. So after 9/11, a lot of countries figured they could get support from the United States if they started using terms like terrorism, because they thought then that they could tie their own struggles into the American struggle with terrorism in a way that maybe improved relations. So in a similar vein, if Trump had won power, then I suspect a lot of governments would have started talking about election fraud in order to legitimize their governments, because they thought that might resonate more with Donald Trump in a way that improved relations. But as was, it didn't work, so I suspect it's going to be more of a hindrance than anything. I think Biden has been pretty clear that his administration is going to adhere to a more traditional American stance of condemning authoritarian regimes. So the election fraud trick isn't going to work here. So I don't think we're going to see too much of it. I think in the case of Burma, which I think is why this person maybe asked this question, the Burmese government used election fraud as a way to try to legitimize their own seizure of power, their own military coup. Keep in mind the coup happened, keep in mind they started alleging election fraud months ago, when Trump was still alleging fraud, but before Trump had left office. So I think in that case, that's an early example of a government trying to exploit American politics and trends in American politics to try to manipulate public perceptions. They knew that there was alleged election fraud in the United States, so they figured maybe if they did it, then it would have been harder for somebody in the United States to allege that they were making it up. But as was, Trump didn't pan out, so I think, if anything, the current government would be very unhappy if another authoritarian government tried to falsely allege election fraud in order to try to maintain legitimacy. That would probably just make things worse for them. So I don't think it'll happen more on that count.
Well, to put it in StarCraft terms, do you think they'll copy this build? Nope. It didn't work.
Yeah, that's pretty much.
Well, cool. Appreciate you coming on and helping us out, figuring out what's going on. There's a lot of change these days. We live in unprecedented times, like always. Trying to piece together the puzzle. Remember that when you're browsing the news, that there's always a bias, and you need to factor the bias in when you're trying to figure out what's going on. Also, remember that we're just two people who are trying to figure out what's going on as well. So if we've made mistakes and said stuff that's incorrect, we're not going to be defensive about it. We would like to know. So let us know in the comments and in Twitch chat and that kind of thing. He reads through the chat of the Agent Smith segment after. So if you have any of those corrections for him, he's going to be very excited and not offended.
Yes, that is the case.
Well, nice. Thank you, Sea of Whiskey, for handling questions, and thank you, chat, for providing them and being pleasant. Hope you can stay warm through this Texas snowstorm that you're being faced by right now.
Yeah.
Be sure to have hot chocolate and stay hydrated, okay?
Sounds like a plan.
All right. Well, take care of yourselves, ladies and gentlemen, and we will see you on the next episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith. Smith.
Okay. Oh, that was a quick one.
Nice.